I can get Alice, unless Alice, you want to take it, I can answer that one a little
I'll
bit.
let you do.
Yeah, so that would be a partnership that we would have to get into with one of our community mental health centers. It's not something that we would stand up in lieu of that. We would want to make sure the community reach or mental health partners or another provider was able to put that together for us. An example that's just come up recently is that mental health partners is now having a full-time dedicated staff for an anxiety kind of walk-in clinic or I think Councilmember Groom said an emergency room, right? But I think they actually are looking at it as almost like an urgent care type of setting for individuals experiencing anxiety. So again, that wouldn't be something we'd stand up. We would do that in partnership with one of our local agencies to help us with that.
Okay, great. Because I totally agree. I mean, and a lot of my friends who, come to me for those issues or, we just talk about mental health a lot pretty openly. A lot of it is, they work really early. One of my friends works at 4 a.m. in the morning, and it's sort of an odd time for her to come home at night. And then she goes to sleep. So I like this 24/7 sort of clinic idea. I think it's important. My last one's going to be just a crucial conversation. And I think a lot of people know me as a Christian. And I am also a Christian that fully believes that we should separate church and state. And I understand that we have these partnerships with our local partners. And I will tell you that I grew up in Young Life, and I was a Young Life leader, and I was a Young Life leader in college. And I fully love Zach Krieger. I think he's just an upstanding citizen, and I think he's really important. I've seen him work in our schools. I went into Westlake and volunteered to tutor. He's a great guy. The issue that I have, though, is that with Young Life, I had asked them if they would accept people who are LGBTQ to also be leaders within their systems, and they do not. And we got to the point where he asked me, well, where do you think these kids should go? So basically, Young Life is taking these kids and shuffling them elsewhere. And I have a huge problem with that, major problem, because they are one of our most vulnerable populations for suicide. And while I love Zach, and I trust him with my children completely, he's the most amazing guy. The system itself and the structure of the system is not working. And I could have these sort of Bible context conversations with people offline. But as it stands right now, I need to know if we have any sort of nonprofit grant funding for Young Life, and I need to know if they have a non-discriminatory or non-discrimination policy. That's very important to me.
I'm not aware, Dan, are you aware if we have that arrangement?
I'm not aware, but I can get back to you with an answer within the next 5 minutes.
And I can just add that I think is Young Life listed as a partner on one of our slides. The reason that was listed is he's been on our Communities that Care Coalition and has been sources of strength. And so just calling out that we are involving people from the faith community who are interested in working with us, but there's no funding that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Councilmember Hinkle, just to further address your point, I think some of us that are involved in the faith-based community, whatever we can do internally as well to address this issue, because I think it starts externally, but also starts internally at that level of acceptance. And if you go back to some of the key principles of acceptance and social justice, I think we can all see that it ties into that. So where can we come to some common ground with these faith-based communities that basically what we're trying to do is achieve the same goal of, that social justice, and, judgment isn't led to certain individuals. Judgment occurs at a much higher level in a faith-based mentality. So I think those are some good conversations to have specifically with our faith-based community to see where they stand, because I know there's a full spectrum dealing with Marty versus others, that you get an idea of what the the dogma and the rules that those faith-based communities are following. So I think it's educational opportunities for us.
I do, and I think it's okay to shine the light on it and to have those crucial conversations, because it's almost double harmful to say we accept you, and at a certain point, actually we don't. And meanwhile, other people are sinning behind closed doors, right? So if you're going to elevate a sin over another, that just because you see it, and again, I can have those conversations offline, but it is very painful, and it could cause suicide.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
Yes. Is there, I think they said that Dan was speaking to the school districts. And I noticed in reading the letters that we received from Adams 12 and Boulder Valley School District that they specifically requested non-grant funding. Am I understanding that correctly? And then what I saw in the presentation was that Broomfield preferred grant and contracts for the external partners. So is there a difference of desires there for the funding to the school districts, or am I reading something that's not there?
No, you're correct. I think the grants, as opposed to like a one-time grant funding or a grant funding that would expire in a certain period of time, or an application process, I think what they're, and I'll defer to Allison because I think she had more conversations than I did, but I think what they're wanting is a contract for services. So as opposed to a grant process that they would compete and apply for. We're saying that we want grant or contract. Those are our preferred. We would not prefer to figure out how to administer these in-house, and we would rather work with the community.
Yeah, and I can just add, Councilmember Lim, that I think what the school districts were implying is, yeah, they are concerned about taking a one-time source of funding or, a 3 to 5 year, whereas they understand that the tax is a sustainable source of funding. And so there's that issue, but then there's also, when we on our slide talked about the options for how to disperse some of the funding, I think grant is one option, and contracts and others are also part of the plan. So I think they're just concerned about, taking a short-term funding for a FTE that really is a long-term type of position.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, because I was really very interested in making, doing everything we can if we have the funding to fulfill the school district's desires there with their, Adams 12 named some programs like Source of Strength they had, and they both referred to that they needed therapists in the schools. So I wondered how that would work. Yeah, I can understand they would need the long-term funding. My other question revolves around the state legislation that's going on right now. So how do you see the state legislation interfacing with programs that we might start locally, or will the state be able to provide further funding for efforts? The governor, I noted the governor just signed the bill to create a state behavioral health administration. And there's a Senate bill, the Behavioral Health Recovery Act, that seems to focus on substance abuse. So are we anticipating that we would be able to incorporate that statewide administration to help our efforts, or that funding to help our efforts?
Yeah, excellent question, Councilmember Lim. We've been tracking what's been happening with the Behavioral Health Task Force, and then what got embedded into the legislative session and the potential bills that are coming out of that. As we continue to do the further analysis on that, I think we'll get a much better sense of what the funding distribution looks like, and funding eligibility, all of those pieces. So we'll continue to monitor that. I know Dan on his side with CHSDA that has a lobbying firm, and the Colorado Association of Local Public Health Officials are closely monitoring that. And we work then very closely with NAE to say, what does that mean for the city and county of Broomfield? So if we start to see that it is not incorporating some of our local county needs, that's the opportunity for us to provide feedback through the legislative session to express our concerns.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Jason did a great job. Councilmember Lim, I just wanted to chime in and say, yeah, the process for the BHA and all of the work that the Mental Health Task Force did, we would anticipate seeing benefits of that for a number of reasons. One, it streamlines the process, and we're talking about funding streams, and we're talking about coordination. You think about the criminal justice system, the child welfare system. There's a lot that goes into this, but you would hope that the BHA then would be able to take Medicaid and private pay insurance and all of those things we've talked about today and coordinate that under one entity. So again, anticipating that it would be a positive outcome for us collectively. And then just quickly to get back to Heidi Hinkle, Councilmember Hinkle's question, we do not currently have any funding arrangements with, now I forgot the name of the organization.
Young Life.
With Young Life, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Okay, Councilmember Law Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I apologize for being all bundled up, but I don't know if y'all got rained on and hailed on just a minute ago, but I'm under the eaves and it was really fun. So I appreciate this coming forward as a study session item, and I very much appreciate Councilmember Groom pushing this along to make sure that we had a study session on it, especially the substance abuse aspect. She and I have had a number of discussions on that. And I think staff, and I apologize for the neighbor's dog barking, but I think staff asked about feedback regarding funding. So I hope you did, because I'm about ready to give it. I do think that while the funding from the new marijuana tax is not going to be, I think Mr. Casey, you said something along the lines of not a whole lot of money or something like that. It's a start. And I would like to see all the net tax receipts after what we need to run the program go to mental health funding along these lines. A great place to start would be fulfilling the school district's request to fund the therapists in the schools. I think that our young people, as we move forward, are going to need a lot more support after the pandemic as we try to integrate back into things. Yep, sorry for the dog. Hey, thanks, Bear. Okay, so a couple of other things. With regards to the mental health emergency room, I do think that it's really important to have ongoing mental health support systems in place that are accessible by anybody who needs to. I think that's important. And I was part of I forget the name of the videos we just filmed. I think myself and Mayor Pro Tem made videos trying to decrease the stigma of accessing mental health services. It's a lot more effective if you do it on an ongoing basis before you hit the need for an emergency room. I just am not sure that I think that a mental health emergency room is a wise use of limited funds already. So for whatever, I'd like to put that out there. And I think this idea of supporting ongoing connectedness is crucial. And I will say that a previous council member talking about a specific organization, and honestly, from my perspective, I support that organization, my family and I do monetarily quite a bit, and to blindside them like that in a public meeting, I think is inappropriate when they do so much good and they do not ask for public funding. So the reason I'm segueing into that I think it's inappropriate to blindside them like that is that they do provide that ongoing connectedness, and they do provide common ground and radical acceptance. My experience with with Young Life is that they do accept everyone and they love them where they are, period. Are there people who may not like that model? I don't know, but I think it's just grossly inappropriate to call them out in a meeting like this without giving them a chance to respond. And I just wanted to say that. So I do think that mental health funding and this connectedness, whether it be through outside organizations such as Young Life or other organizations, I don't even know what other ones there are, that has to be the priority, because getting people connected to one another with their own network solves so many problems to begin with that maybe they won't need the mental health emergency room. So I guess I didn't really ask any questions, but that's my feedback on funding and on outside organizations. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, appreciate it.
Councilmember Tessier.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to the Health and Human Services team for putting this together. I appreciate everybody's comments too, really thoughtful. I had a question around maybe, I guess where my mind is coming from, like, I don't want to lose sight of, extinguishing the stigma around mental health. I feel like that is going to be the biggest push, because as soon as we make the stigma go away, then people will want to access. I still think there's a lot of fear. I also wonder too if there's more education around like family systems or support groups for family members who have children who are experiencing this. There are a lot of new parent groups when you first have a kid, and it's all fun. And when shit hits the fan, and there are some really, when it is shown that the genetics from a family line are being passed down, be it depression, be it anxiety, that those families, brothers, sisters, parents, in addition to the child who's experiencing those, are all kind of getting education and finding ways to support. Is that, because that was one of the things that came up too I was in the Communities That Care Positive Youth Development earlier today, and it seems like that piece is missing often. And I didn't know if you had any information on that.
Yeah, I'll take a stab, and then obviously I'll let Allison weigh in as well. I think you're exactly right, Sharon, that we need to dive deeper into some of these strategies and the partnerships and what it looks like, and just not do the cookie cutter approach or the traditional evidence-based program and you implement it with this level of fidelity. We know Broomfield likes, and we succeed in doing ways that meets the needs of our community. So I would be very open to that continued conversation. How do we make this successful? Because I do think that's an extremely important point as we go forward. And that's where we really do rely on you as our policy making body, as we're doing study sessions and others, to give us this feedback, because I think it's extremely important as we start to engage in those conversations and making sure what we're building is the right approach for Broomfield.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think I was very much going to mention the state policy. So thank you, Councilmember Lim. And, this goes to congressional policy too. Even when we do have insurance, it is 10 sessions, and 10 sessions is not nearly enough. You're just barely getting to know your therapist at that point. and then you have to stop. And so there has got to be another way. And there are people who don't like the traditional talk therapy. So, I mean, we have to look at alternative ways. And this is what I absolutely love about this approach. It's holistic. It's not singling anything out. It's all part of who we are as humans. We're all mixed emotions and full of life and sadness and all of this in one little tight ball. And we can't tell, because I think what we're seeing too is our kids don't like the traditional talk therapy. There's got to be a way to move through different ways of and then what about the connectedness? So what about the introverts who also need the connectedness? There's a lot of that too. And I'm really just nitpicking because these are some of the gaps that I see in this. And my family is struggling with depression, runs in our family, and it is really shining now with COVID. And so it's really important to have these conversations, and I will make it my life's mission to continue to blast the stigma around mental illness, and that should be included in our healthcare. It should not even be a separate word, right? It should not. So I think that that's all I really wanted to say. I appreciated the approach, and I think it goes beyond just substance use and abuse and misuse. It's everything, because humans are way more complex and sophisticated. So I appreciate you looking at this approach.
And Councilmember Tessier brought up a couple of key points that I think we're continually working on with the metro region. And a couple of those is, one is, how do we look at that issue that you just brought up of, that integrated approach, because no wrong door to be able to go in and get services. And, we had some momentum going on in that direction when we're incorporating mental health professionals in with physical health. And so when you're coming in for your appointment, you had the opportunity to have those conversations. And that's one thing that we're resurrecting, and having those conversations with those partners. I think the second thing that you brought up is an extremely important point, is as we continue to go through this and define what the service delivery model looks like for Broomfield, we'll have to understand that the rest of the state or region might be approaching it from a different perspective, but that'll take advocacy on our part and strong conversations with either partners or legislators or others that control the funding streams and the roles. And that's where I feel very confident with Danae and Dan and our team that can analyze all the legislation coming down and what it means for not only the state, but Broomfield Public Health, or Broomfield just health in general.
Jason, I'll just say one more thing. Like my family, I'm on a separate insurance. My husband's on his insurance, and my kids are on a third insurance, because it's just, our needs are different, and it's ridiculous. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm really excited about everything that the department has been working on. I've been following in HSAC.
Darlene, we're having trouble hearing you from time to time.
My mic. Is it any better?
Can hear you now, yeah.
Okay, it was in the wrong setting. And I know you guys are doing such great work, and we're just starting our journey on diversity, equity, inclusion. But I did participate in the Let's Talk campaign, and I told my story of feeling rejected, not accepted, the isolation. And a lot of this did come from religious groups. I have to be honest. That's where the dogma, that's where the judgment came from. And I really want to insist again that we implement a non-discrimination policy requirement from any of our nonprofit partners, especially if they're going to be receiving any of our funds or resources or grants. Because I know Councilmember Law Evans thought that Councilmember Henkel blindsided Young Life. Well, I was blindsided when I saw Young Life on that slide, because they have caused harm to the LGBTQ youth. It's been in the paper, in the Denver Post several times. This is not new information. And we're a secular organization, so there has to be boundaries. If we're saying on one slide that our LGBTQ youth are in danger, and then we're going to work with an organization that treats them differently and discriminates against them, I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. So I think we need to be really careful and vet all of these community partners, because this is not new information. And that's really all I'm going to say today. Thanks.
Councilmember Lindstedt.
Thank you, Mayor. I have well, I'm gonna pick on one point here, and that is number 6 in the behavioral health funding plan. And I know, Jason, you were probably expecting me to ask about this, but I guess one priority for me would be, and I wish the chart here was numbered, but it would be work with Broomfield Community Mental Health Centers to develop and enhance access to their continuum of substance misuse care that stretches from prevention. And here's a really important part, to treatment to community-based recovery. One thing I really don't want people to forget or overlook. We have people in our community who are struggling with substance abuse and who are struggling. They might not be ready, or they might not be able to get out of that yet, and they need some help. So we might be underneath the statewide average of overdose deaths and of overdose hospitalizations. I don't take a lot of solace in that, just because certain counties are such outliers in terms of those averages. So this seems way down on the funding list here, and I would really like to see it prioritized. We had 10 overdose deaths in Broomfield last year. We're at 220 per 100,000 people of hospitalizations from overdoses. And I just think it's really, really important to remember that there are people in our community who are struggling. We have fentanyl in our community. We have heroin in our community. And I don't want us to overlook really, really serious issues in a population that maybe doesn't have the loudest advocates. So that's a big priority for me. And then I guess one question I did have while we're kind of discussing what to do with this marijuana funding, what is our policy? And I think I might have asked this a year ago, but what is our, in terms of resources for naloxone access? Do we need more money for that? Do we need to prioritize that? I know that the chief's on the line. I don't know who would be best to answer that question, but that's a priority of mine, and I'd just love to hear from staff, what the plans are.
Yeah, Chief, I know we've had these conversations in the past. Would you be willing to discuss what we have identified and potential next steps?
I'm having a little bit of internet trouble. Can you guys hear me?
Mostly. You're frozen now.
I'm sorry.
It's not working.
William, do you want to go on to the next question? And
Yeah.
Chief, do you want to just call in?
Yeah, I think I could answer it, Jennifer, too, and then
Oh, that'd be great.
depending on if Chief wants to add more. We started to look at naloxone and how we could best do this in Broomfield. As you're aware, some of the EMT providers are already naloxone providers. Additionally, PD has the ability to distribute naloxone. I think the next step, Councilmember Lindstedt, would be looking at the current rules and regulations. I believe that provide some ability for like pharmacies and other community members to also be the ones that are distributing it. And so that's one area that we're definitely looking very closely at. The other one is safe storage, obviously, of not only medications, but of needles and other potentially risky situations that could then lead to transmission if they're just left out in parks and other ways. So could we create a safe needle exchange program that, you know, individuals feel safe and it's they can't be identified, drop off their needles, and it really, again, just creates that protective measure for us from a public health perspective. And if Chief did call back in, I'll let him weigh in on what I missed. But I do know that we have been working very closely with the Chief on how we move forward to implement that.
Go ahead, Chief.
Yes, I apologize for the unstableness of my internet connection. Hopefully that'll resolve here momentarily. So all of our officers are issued 2 doses of Narcan. They carry with them all the time. We just replaced the Narcan. We've been replacing it prior to expiration, which is about every 2 years, based on a state grant. And of course, if any of it's used, we automatically replace it for the officer that used the naloxone. So as long as the state grant is in place, we immediately replace that at no cost to the city and county of Broomfield. However, each year we have enough forewarning if the grant funds were to dry up to incorporate those in our budget, make sure that our officers are carrying it. We do find that it is a critical piece of equipment that our officers have.
Thank you for that answer, Chief. I guess I'll just close out by saying I'm a little bit disappointed to see it down at number 6 and to see this part of it unfunded. I think there's a part of our community that really could use some advocacy. So that's we're all close. So,
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that I wish we had the ability to fund all these programs. And I look forward to the progress as we implement more pieces of this behavioral health plan. I'm just curious, the input from BVSD and Adams 12 focus on the chronic use of marijuana and the impact on the attention and memory deficits, development mind, IQ. And is that concern for the high potency marijuana products the only concern called out because of our recent discussions on marijuana regulations? And do they have as much concern for other substance abuse or other issues? Is our focus just because that's where we've focused recently?
Allison, you want to take that?
Yeah, Councilmember Anderson, I do think that it's not, they were following up on their previous letters, but for sure it isn't only marijuana or even high potency marijuana. They feel that they need resources to address behavioral health across the board.
Okay, thank you. That's kind of what I was thinking, that it was just more focused there because of our recent discussion. And then I want to also, this is just a note, and I appreciate this discussion tonight and the need to move forward on these mental health issues. But I just gotta say, I was naive in a recent discussion with a school counselor. I did not realize that school counseling was limited to helping students with course selection, like managing their time and homework, and just a periodic someone to talk to from time to time. I guess the word counselor to me meant something different. And I kind of thought they could solve some of the students' emotional needs during COVID. So I think this is like, this is like a really important piece. I know they're all important, but I am definitely hopeful that we can provide more funding or the funding necessary to help students with a therapy that could help them socially and emotionally for their developing minds, their developing bodies. I mean, this is like a critical time to reach kids. So I really think that's a important place also. And the more we can do for those students, the better. So thank you for all the efforts on this topic, and appreciate, look forward to another update. Thank you.
Thank you for raising that, Councilmember Anderson, because those have been some of the conversations we've been having. It's been pretty obvious as we developed this, and now we're in the midst of COVID, of the impact COVID has had on mental health, specifically in our high school in our middle school and high school populations. And I think the old traditional approach, like you just described, is not the approach that we need to move forward with. And so I can tell you, talking to Superintendent Godowski and Superintendent Anderson, there is a willingness to start to think about what does this look like from more of a holistic perspective, given what all of our children have gone throughout the last year and a half, and how to support them best. And again, as Dan mentioned, that could be accomplished through multiple modalities. It could be having these therapists specifically embedded in the school. It could be finding therapists who are really good at this that we could contract with, that are working within the schools. I think that's what we're exploring right now. What's the best modality to make this effective for our youth, because that's the most important piece.
Thank you. And I'll just add one comment there too. I know there's a discussion a little earlier about, whether somebody has private insurance or not. And I would almost think, honestly, like, if you want to go the route of, pulling your student out of school to take them to a private funded, someone within your insurance network, is very disruptive, as opposed to if there's someone who can just start that conversation. And I suppose there's got to be a method of doing this with privacy or however that works. But to just, because sometimes it might just take a couple conversations, but sometimes it might go on longer, and to just be able to pull them out of class for a short time is far less disruptive than to take them off site. So I hope that conversation is like all encompassing of all kids, regardless of status of any status, just to meet them where they're at. So I think this is a great step in the right direction. So thank you.
Councilmember Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you to the work of our public health team and the work of our behavioral health, work on the behavioral health plan. As we walk through this COVID pandemic, many of us have missed our annual wellness visits, physical health visits. And at the same time, during the pandemic, I have even visited the emergency room for a back injury. So I'm well aware of the benefits of that preventative health care, and also the great need for our emergency care. We do have mental health. Mental health emergency service. But what really we're missing is that mental health wellness check. If our insurance industry and our government systems could support and invest in the implementation of a preventative mental health wellness check, we could greatly improve lives and even save lives. So, I look forward to the progress of our state legislature on this issue, and really hope that this year we can, move this forward, because this is an area that's greatly needed.
Councilmember Schaaf, can I specifically address that? Because
I would love for you to.
Okay, there's a mental health parity bill that's going through the legislature. And the idea behind that is the way that we treat physical health, treating behavioral health in the same fashion. And so I think the idea behind that is how do we do it in a way that, again, addresses where people may be with a behavioral health issue, and then more importantly, being able to provide those holistic services, because they're should be covered at the same time as when you go in and get a diabetes screening and find out you have type 2 diabetes and you get your medication prescribed. So that is working through the state legislature. I'm sure Danae would know the latest status on it, and so we'll be happy to follow up on that one.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I recall there was a similar bill working its way through the legislature in 2020. And unfortunately, the pandemic kind of closed many doors, including the doors of the Capitol early, and prevented that bill from moving forward at that point. So, hopefully this bill does move all the way through the legislature and get signed by the governor, this spring. That would be huge. On the flip side, outside of, council work, as a teacher in our schools, I see every day the benefits of trained and licensed therapists serving our students. This past year in my kids' school, we finally had a full-time counselor instead of a part-time one. And this is huge. It provides the social and emotional support and learning on top of the academic studies. And, in many ways, as I saw even today, it supports, the actual ability to learn, those academic studies. So, it is huge. So, really for me, it's a big thank you to those in-school therapists that are supporting our students, our parents, our families, and our teachers in the work that is happening there. I really do think that it's important for our steering committee to continue to work on, on behavioral health, to identify the gaps and guide this work that's happening right now, especially in a year of the pandemic where we have seen poverty rise, unemployment grow, housing getting scarce, not to mention social isolation. When we talk about the lasting impacts of the pandemic, we have to recognize that mental health could be a long-term effect. We need to address this in the immediate, the short-term, mid-term, and long-term. But to not attack this, issue kind of in a stimulus way, as the federal government's doing, could create even more lasting issues down the road. So I'm curious, what immediate efforts are being made or have been made to support our community as we continue to recover from this pandemic?
Yeah, I could tell a couple of things, but I'll turn it over to the team to talk about it. Specifically, we are playing an advocacy role with the governor's office and state legislature, specifically to what you said, that with these funding coming in, we really have to make sure that it's invested in behavioral health because of, we know, the significant impacts of COVID. The other things is we've had really direct conversations with our regional accountable care entity and with our master service organization. And again, both of them are sort of that network provider for services that are being offered, and having some direct conversations with them of what can now be covered under benefits, and how's that expanding. And then lastly is just as we identify gaps in Broomfield, I think we have to have then that critical conversation is this the role of Broomfield funding to be able to address this, or do we need to have, again, conversations with others of how do we secure that funding to specifically address this issue? And I'm with you, Councilmember Schaaf. I think as we start to move beyond the pandemic, what we're going to realize is we're going to see a great divide. And the great divide is going to be due to a lot of things. And specifically, it's going to be addressed in some of those issues we brought up before around housing and security, obviously income, education, other aspects, and how that it leads to chronic stress and potential behavioral health issues. The other side of the coin, as we begin to look at that, is how do we also build up some of those protective factors? And I had the great opportunity, this is a plug, but I was up until 11 o'clock last night trying to wind down from our council meeting. And I watched the PBS story on Frontline that talked about all of the experiences the entire world has gone through with this COVID pandemic and where people are at. And I think the thing that was most shocking to me was the great divide that occurred between the higher SES individuals in certain countries and the lower SES individuals in certain countries, and how that continued to lead to increased pressure, stress, anxiety that just kept building up and building up and building it up. And I believe that's where our work is going to be going forward.
Well, I really do appreciate that. And, I do, look forward to, the ways in which we will continue to build and continue to grow out of this this pandemic. At this point, we do have some of those stimulus funds from the federal government through the state government heading to Broomfield. Is there a plan at this point to use some of that funding for behavioral health?
I can take that one, Jason. Councilmember Schaaf, we have not had those conversations. We are continuing to wait the long anticipated guidelines and restrictions that come with those two pots of funding. We'll see 10 million this year, approximately 10 million next year. Once we get those guidelines, we will circle back with council. We do have our council priority focus updates coming in July, anticipating that we'll certainly have those guidelines by then. And at that point, we'll put packages together of how it can be spent, and then council will direct where those funds should go.
Great, thank you. I think that this pandemic has shown the importance of connectedness and the vulnerabilities in our population. What opportunities are there for they're coming up? For people to connect in person or in a hybrid way, for people to connect, especially those that are most vulnerable.
Great question. And, all of this is going to be as we potentially move out of the pandemic and where individuals feel safe, but obviously community connectedness that we've strategically identified. What are those opportunities through Zoom, Google Meet, and other opportunities? And we're seeing some of this between our Broomfield Youth for Youth population and some of our older adult population, which is amazing to see that cross-generational support with each other and those trusted adults. But what I would like to see is as we get to a place where we could potentially have more in-person meetings, we start to think about ways that we are supporting each other specifically for populations that we know have specific practices, discriminations, other things that are stacked against them, and having more of those community dialogues and discussions and figuring out then what does that mean for us as a city and county of Broomfield to take actionable steps to not just address the top issue of behavioral health, but diving much deeper. And Councilmember Schaaf, you'll remember those presentations that we had, a meeting with those parents around substance misuse and some of the stories we heard around the need for connectedness in that community, especially those parents, to be able to bond and share their stories. And my hope is as we start to work through this, we can build more of those types of opportunities for our community members to come together, connect, and support each other.
Well, that's a great note to end on. You know, the possibilities in the future are bright and are great. And it's one in which, you know, I look forward to a more healthy mental health state of our entire community. So thank you for your work. Thank you for the presentation. That's all I have for tonight, Mayor. Thank you.
Councilor Jezierski.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to be pretty brief. There've been a lot of great comments. I'm not sure I can top anything that's been said to this point. Jason, thank you, and the rest of the staff for your presentation and your work on this topic. Certainly very important for our community. Mental health affects every one of us at some point in our lives, and I think this year, particularly with COVID, it's affecting a lot of us, myself as well. And I think one of the key points that you have brought up and was just mentioned by Councilmember Schaaf is the connectedness. I mean, I think that's a big point in prevention and probably treatment as well. And I think it's, you know, great that you're recognizing that. And I do share the optimism that, you know, hopefully as things continue to open up, you know, we'll be able to offer, you know, more and more opportunities for really an in-person connection. I think Zoom was a good Band-Aid, you know, just to some extent over the past year, but does not nearly compete with, you know, one-on-one interaction, you know, seeing people in person, touching, hugging, and whatever else. So I think that's great. I just want to reiterate, I do support, as Councilmember Anderson mentioned, you know, every program that's, you know, it'd be great if we could support every program that you've listed in your presentation today. But I specifically, and it's been mentioned by a couple of council members, and I have a soft spot for the schools and our children. So just want to make clear that fully support any kind of funding you can do to bring therapists, psychologists, and other treatment providers to our schools. And you know it all already. COVID's been tough for all of our kids. The isolation, the masks, and just the general fear, I guess. And it's needed now more than ever. So thank you. Keep up the good work.
And once again, I apologize for missing the first few minutes. I mean, I'm not sure this was covered. I guess I'm trying to put this in perspective. So maybe it's a summary at the end. I mean, council has a separate goal, except for marijuana. We have a separate goal of behavioral health improvement, of mental health, correct? And that you guys gave us presentation. So the fact that we're having this session related to the marijuana is not necessarily, there's not a direct connection there per se. I mean, they're two separate issues. And I think part of the attitude was that your point's well taken. We're going to generate, let's just say $750,000 this year in marijuana revenue. But you guys have outlined $3 million worth of needs. And what I'm hearing from council here is that they're all receptive to what you've recommended tonight. And a lot of those have a lot of ranges. And so I guess I just want to make it very clear. It probably wasn't made at the beginning, so I'll make it very clear at the ending that, that your budget for mental health shouldn't be dependent upon marijuana. I think what we've established tonight, that we are doing, regardless of the marijuana money, we are spending that much or more on new behavioral health improvement, ideas of mental health. I mean, to me, that's the takeaway. And I hear council completely supporting you in this action. And I would assume that you'd come back you know, I'll address this with Jennifer, that I would presume you come back with some type of budget recommendations, because right now there's some pretty good ranges in your numbers. And to the extent that you guys, you know, particularly for the school programs for next year, that it may be, I don't know if we need a budget amendment to initiate some of those new programs or what, but I mean, it seems to me that council's very interested in hearing the next step on this. And I see everybody nodding their head. So I think, unless Jennifer, you want to say anything else or ask anything else, we can move on to Independent Housing Authority.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, it was a great exercise for all of us to put dollar amounts, which is just from a staff perspective, is something that we are being more disciplined to do with projects, initiatives, ideas. So resources are attached, and that includes additional staffing that will be required. So again, it was a great exercise for us to really identify what that gap is and what the needs are, to circle back and have that conversation with council when we're able to vet it more fully. So Jason, Dan, Allison, Sarah,
yeah,
we're grateful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It's needed and it's eye-opening. So thank you. So let's go ahead and move on to then the discussion about the Independent Housing Authority.
Yes, thank you. Cheryl St. Clair, our housing manager, and John Hall, our City County Economic Vitality Director. That's always such a mouthful. Cheryl will walk us through. John can address the overall housing. We also have some Broomfield housing folks on the call with us. I think Alan is joining us, and Bob, I believe. With that, Cheryl.
Great. Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and City Council members. I am pleased to be here this evening to discuss the questions that were raised previously by Council regarding a transition to an independent housing authority. Along with me, as Ms. Hoffman mentioned, I do have various members of the Housing Advisory Committee who have been working on this research and presentation for quite some time, and I will introduce them here in a bit, as well as a consulting attorney that has worked with a number of housing authorities and cities regarding the same type of transition. So I will introduce all of those as we get through. But the goal here tonight is to provide you with some additional information and details on how a transition might work, and the roles and responsibilities of both the new Housing Authority Board as well as the city, the existing city staff and council. Next slide, please. So just to bring you up to speed on where we are at, to give you a little bit of history. So prior to becoming the city and county, the residents, the lower income residents of Broomfield were served by the housing programs of Adams County, Boulder County, and Jefferson County housing authorities. When we became a county, we entered into intergovernmental agreements with both Boulder County and Jefferson County to authorize them to continue serving our residents as we established our own housing authority and began to apply for federal funding to be able to serve our residents directly. So the City Council at that time determined a need for a new housing authority and set one up legally. And at that point, members of the City Council were appointed to serve as the commissioners of the Housing Authority Board. Over the next several years, the city staff applied for federal funds to start up and operate our own programs, such as the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And unfortunately, none of those applications were funded. And really the reason for that was that HUD and the federal government were not funding any new programs, and we would have been considered a new program. So we continued to operate and serve our existing residents that had been served by the other county housing authorities, and they were continued to be served as we moved through those funding applications. Next slide, please. So moving on to 2016, with some input from the community organizations, the nonprofits and churches, and some of the other service providers in the city, City Council established and appointed the Housing Advisory Committee. And the work of the committee was to really further a study of what the housing gaps in Broomfield were, to understand all of our options, to look at our inventory of housing, and really to bring some recommendations and some priorities back to the City Council for Council to look at possibly implementing new programs. So in doing that, one of the first things that the Housing Committee recommended was to commission a housing needs assessment. And BBC Consulting was hired to do that and brought to us, a very in-depth analysis of what the existing conditions were or are, and made a number of recommendations as far as moving forward to address the needs and the gaps in Broomfield. So one of those recommendations was to consider establishing an independent housing authority board, and the benefits to doing that would allow us to further our housing options and create more affordable housing. So at that point, City Council requested further study regarding that recommendation, and that's where we are today. So I want to, at this point, introduce Lee Applegate, who I am thrilled that we have been able to engage her as a consulting attorney. And just to give you a little bit of background on Lee, she's been a Colorado attorney for 37 years. Most of her career has been in affordable housing, representing a variety of housing authorities, nonprofits, for-profit owners of senior and multifamily properties, all with federal assistance contracts. She actually began her affordable housing career assisting Indian housing authorities, and that's how she got really the experience with federal programs. She then fine-tuned all of her experience and has become one of the preeminent attorneys in Colorado, assisting a number of Colorado housing authorities as their general counsel or special counsel for specific projects. Presently, she is the counsel for 6 housing authorities and several private owners. She's also worked on a variety of low-income housing tax credit developments like our Academy Place that we recently participated in Broomfield. And she has also completed several successful defenses of fair housing, fair lending cases for housing authorities, and handles general real estate matters. Lee is an occasional speaker for housing authority issues, and she has published on topics about senior housing issues with the Colorado Bar Association Continuing Legal Education Division. So I could go on and on about Lee. I'm thrilled that she's been able to find the time to help us and answer all of our questions about this transition. So I'm going to turn the next few slides over to Lee to walk through some of the legal state statutes and some of the roles that a housing authority can play under the state statute. So we go to the next slide. And Lee, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's so great to be here. Hey, everybody. I'm looking forward to just getting right into this. I think probably from the section report that you have. You got a lot of detail, which just shows that this group's ready to go for sure. So this statute lists some of the powers of the housing authority. And, you know, we're housing authority board members right now. You're not sitting as the housing authority right now, but you are the housing authority board. And so, you know, you're probably familiar with most of these. There are a number of them, and they are quite, I would say, wide-reaching. There's even a catch-all provision that, you know, if there's any not listed here, you know, then the effort was made to be sure that the grant of the power to do all things necessary and convenient in order that the purposes of the housing authorities law be furthered, then that's even in the catch-all. So I suspect that you are very familiar with these powers. I've been using them for several years as the Housing Authority Board. And I've also seen the work that you've done to investigate and understand the housing needs for all the citizens of your community. It was great catching back up with Cheryl and Alan and Bob and some of the other folks who are old time housers, we call each other, but I commend you on your Housing Advisory Council. It is quite an asset, and they have done a lot of work to help you understand and investigate the needs, evaluate the recommendations made by the experts, your needs assessments or your other studies. And I know you listen to the Housing Advisory Council quite closely. I know of many other housing authorities in the growing phase that would have been extremely excited to have that as a resource. So the question becomes, can Broomfield make changes to how it appoints housing authority commissioners so that the end result is an improvement to the agency that elevates all of Broomfield so that all the powers may be utilized to benefit the housing needs of the entire community? So how can we proceed so that our housing authority is the most effective it can be, that it's the most responsive it can be? Next slide, please. The tax exempt nature of a housing authority is probably not very surprising to most folks, because it is an independent government entity. It's tax exempt in just about any way, shape, or form you can think of. I don't know how that compares to some other entities like your Urban Renewal Authority or maybe other special districts. I'm not sure, but I would gather that the specific provisions that the legislature has added over the last decade or so to provide that during construction, the sales and use taxes for a project would be exempt, and then the ongoing affordability component of the real estate tax exemption which helps the entire cost of the project. And that this applies not just to property owned by the housing authority, but by property owned by an entity in which the housing authority has an ownership interest, or an entity that's wholly owned by the housing authority that is a member of another entity. So the legislature has allowed this to become quite expanded. Yeah, housing authority property has always been tax exempt, from the beginning. But this allows housing authorities to partner to assist in the ways that it can by helping to keep the projects affordable and keeping their risks lower, because the housing authority only has to have a very small fractional interest of ownership for these benefits to apply to the entire project. So I think next slide then, is that for you, Cheryl?
Sure. So thanks, Lee. Just kind of that overview of the legal powers and kind of a description of the housing authority. And so we want to just briefly kind of run through the benefits and some of the concerns that I know have been raised in the past. So, sort of what Lee mentioned, there's an independent board will have a little more flexibility. They will have a quicker decision-making process. They could meet more often. We don't have to compete with other city business for getting on agendas. And you can really establish a community-driven housing authority by putting members of the community that have expertise in housing on your housing authority board. So really, some of the duties and responsibilities would shift from the city to the dedicated board, and these board members would focus, solely on the matters of the housing authority without, competition from other interests. The other piece of another benefit that I did want to mention is there are a variety of resources and grants out there that are available only to a housing authority, an independent housing authority, versus a city managed housing authority. So there will be resources that this group could tap into, grants that they could bring in and leverage other funding. And again, that all leads to being able to build or provide more affordable housing. Next slide, please. So I think I'm going to, Lee can address some of these questions and other benefits when maybe we get to the discussion piece. But again, the mayor of the city council would still appoint the housing authority board members, so there continues to be involvement there. And I actually, Lee, I'm going to have you, talk a bit here about the legal relationship between the city council and the appointing board and the ongoing liability.
That's no problem. Thank you. Yes, as I understand it, one of the concerns was the liability of the city for an independent housing authority board that's, operating separate from you all. And the important thing is that it has to be separate in order for the city liability to be non-existent, actually. As long as the housing authority is independent in every way. So I mean, structurally, operationally, supervisory, management, and the city can't really have any right to direct or micromanage or manage the housing authority, then the law is very clear that the housing authority would be a separate entity and would have no exposure that it would bring to the city or the city council. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the city wouldn't be sued. My saying always goes, you can be sued anytime by anybody for no reason, because you don't need a reason. No one examines your case until you've had to already defend yourself quite a bit. So, but in terms of actual risk or liability, the point that I am making at the last bullet point, you have the risk now because you are responsible for the housing authority. So if the management and control is transferred to the independent board, then similarly, the risks and the exposure are also transferred. So there's a question, and we can do that now or later. It's up to you all. Maybe, I don't know if Cheryl, if you have a preference.
So let's walk through. We only have a couple more slides, and then I know that the mayor and council members will have some specific questions for you. So if we go to the next slide, and let me just kind of wrap through these a little bit. So, so the transferring, as Lee was just mentioning to you, transfers of control and the potential for liability and risk to the housing authority and away from the city. So other things that we've talked about, real estate opportunities that they can jump on. And I think, to be real clear from a staff perspective here, that the housing authority would still be subject to any applicable city rules, processes. So let's say the housing authority wanted to purchase a plot of land and build an affordable housing complex, they would still have to go through all of our planning processes and permitting processes and everything, just like any private developer or any of our nonprofits that we work with. So all of that would still, they would be subject to all of that. Next slide, please. So a couple of concerns I know that were brought up previously were the appointment or removal and replacement of housing authority board members, and how that would, how the city council would handle that or could handle that. And actually a housing authority establishment, and then the ability to dissolve a housing authority if they so deemed that they wanted to do that. So those questions, and Lee, if you want to briefly address those couple concerns.
Sure, thanks. Well, we talked a little bit about the city liability, and that's going to come into play with regard to a number of other practical questions and answers that we'll discuss after, I think in the next slides or two. removal, replacement of individual housing authority board members. And I provided the information for you in the study session report, that the housing authority statute, does have provisions to, for a board member to be removed, basically for inefficiency, neglect of duty, misconduct in office. They have an opportunity to be heard prior to a decision being made. But this is one way, along with appointing the board members, that the city can stay involved. I think also that most housing authorities I work with have some provisions of their own. Usually they're in the bylaws that where there are, they would go beyond the statute and they would provide for other ways to self-police. And they would have additional rules where if the board member chose to flaunt them or ignore them, then there would be consequences in that way. I don't see this being used very often, but it's obviously important, because if you have someone who is a problem and disrupting everything, if it can't be worked out with that person and with the rest of the board members as a team, then just so you are aware, there are procedures for that. And then, yes, you have the ability to dissolve a housing authority. That's, no one's going to benefit by that. So what I'll say is that if this is permitted to proceed and you end up with an independent housing authority board, and for some reason you would like to change the manner of appointing the commissioners for the housing authority back to yourselves, all you do is go through this process that we're about to discuss. It's not dissimilar to the process that you followed when you were creating a housing authority. But basically, you just go about that in reverse. And so what I've seen, and I know some of the Housing Advisory Council folks have experiences as well, but I've seen housing authority with its own board. There were issues where HUD was very concerned that the housing authority was in serious violation of a lot of requirements. And so I worked with the city attorney, and she, we prepared the documents necessary because the city council wanted to take over the housing authority so that they would be the housing authority just as you are now. And that was done for probably, I'd say a year, maybe year and a half. And then council didn't, want that job anymore. So they would, so then they just went through the procedure one more time and transferred the control and to the independent board, which is now working a lot better than it was before. So there's no there are tethers and as you'll see when we talk more about the practicalities excuse me, doing this, there's going to be a lot of communication and a lot of working together. So I just wanted you to be aware of the options that are available.
We sure
authority isn't going to run and hide, and we have to have open meetings and open records. And
Lee, we sure appreciate all that. So if we could, that's a lot of information for council to digest. The mayor had asked a question before we kind of move back to Cheryl. John's going to walk us through what the budget are, the budget implications. But yes, Mayor, the question, council does control the budget, provides control just as they do policy setting. So like inclusionary zoning, business development agreements, reimbursement amounts. And this is we intend this to be a, John and Cheryl can walk us through what the graduated conversations are, whether it's the existing committee board that we have that transitions into a independent housing authority. Staffing is a question. In most places, existing city county staff remains the point person, which we have a lot of conversations that are coming up with our fabulous housing manager taking her new path in life, what that position means, if that's the point person from the executive position. John, do you want to talk a little bit about what that timeline looks like and the possibilities around that?
Certainly, City Manager Hoffman. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and Council. John Hall, Director of Economic Vitality. And just to remind everyone that the housing team is now nested within Economic Vitality so that they can be afforded some additional support in their efforts. And as we move forward in this discussion, we are naturally coming to the point of some questions around what do the next steps look like. And I think at a staff level, and I'm going to ask Cheryl to chime in a minute, and then we may afford some opportunity for our Housing Advisory Committee members as well. The obvious first step would be the possible creation of an independent housing authority board that could continue to be staffed and served by existing City and County of Broomfield housing program staff. That would be the next small step, and that independent housing authority could then make recommendations to the City Council on a variety of topics, including, as Cheryl was beginning to outline, anything related to developments that are coming through the city, and the kinds of recommendations that you often see coming forward from the Housing Advisory Committee now would be taken over by the Independent Housing Authority Board. Moving forward then, as that board begins to develop its own resources, sources of funding, which could include anything from the use of the Housing Trust Fund to independent grants to the acquisition of property, then they would begin to develop their own sources of income that would allow them further autonomy. That will take some time to develop. And in the interim, we do foresee current staff continuing to serve in the role of furthering affordable housing in the city and county. With that, I'd like to ask Cheryl to jump in with any additional comments.
Thanks, John. If we could go to the last slide. So these are kind of the things we were thinking about as far as the transition, and John just mentioned most of those, and that, you know, transitioning to this independent board would still be, there would be a transition time, and we did anticipate that there would be some staff loaned, basically from the city that would work as I do now with the current Housing Advisory Committee as their staff. Some office space equipment, maybe some operating funds from the Housing Development Fund, our cash in lieu contributions that we're receiving from our developers. You know, those have been discussed as a use for furthering our affordable housing goals. And that could be then determined by council to either grant or loan to the new Housing Authority Board so that they could start purchasing properties, land, buildings, and leverage it with other grants that they would be able to procure because they were an independent board. So those are the things we were thinking we would need as a transition. And this has happened in various other entities, and that is usually how it's been set up. So this IGA that we would bring back to City Council would have these details outlined in them. So it would be the detail of how that relationship would work, how long it might go on. As John mentioned, once the Housing Authority Board had its own sources of revenue, then maybe that would be the trigger to they hire their own staff. But there would be a transition, but that would be a component of this intergovernmental agreement. So if council wants us to pursue this and to bring back the detailed intergovernmental agreement, that's what we're actually looking for tonight. And then to answer your questions on, you know, how that relationship could work, Tony Castle has been here. I'm not sure if he's still connected or not. And Alan Feinstein and also Linda Fahrenbrook. So I have three of the Housing Advisory Committee members have joined us. And Alan, I know, has done this process with Jefferson County. If you have specific questions on how maybe, you know, that transition works. But I know Tony wanted to say a couple words about the Housing Advisory Committee's process and how they kind of got here. And I'll let Tony just briefly make a statement, and then we'll turn it back over to you, Mayor.
Thank you, Cheryl. I appreciate the short leash, and I promise you I will make good use of a short leash. I just really, we have the experts here, and we've had the experts really as part of our committee, and we've had that from day one. So basically, you know, when we started this process, we took we were very thoughtful, and we wanted to really move this forward and make it clear to the council, you know, what the concerns would be, what the benefits would be. We sought out the best in the field with Lee in terms of legal support, and that brings us to where we are this evening. You know, I have to say now is the time for this to move forward. We've talked about it. I think the political will is strong for this. But in Denver, you've all seen the media talking about how Denver and certainly in Broomfield, you know, the housing situation is in a difficult state. Values are, real estate values are going crazy. And we're seeing, you know, it's accelerating, and we're seeing historic highs for costs. So, you know, as Broomfield, as our population grows, of course, we're also, you know, it's exacerbated from that standpoint. So I think it's clear that our goal for tonight is to give you, the council, the background, the understanding, and the basis from which to ask intelligent questions, and then ultimately, you know, identify next steps. And we've made that clear. Hopefully we can identify a way to put the agreement together, at least for first draft, and start your review there. But I think what's important, you know, from day one, we've had a pretty solid, experienced group of professionals that can really help and move this ball forward. I think one of the key benefits, there's a couple Cheryl touched on, especially from the standpoint of having such a full plate as city council today, to take this huge issue off your plate and move it into a group that's all they do. It makes so much sense. It gives you back the work cycles that you need to attach business that relates directly to the council. And we want to take advantage of, the housing opportunities as they arise, especially in today's market where houses are going off the market within a day, oftentimes 20, 30, 40,000 over asking price. We think if we can find and develop networks and manage those networks to help us make acquisitions for property and projects, it puts us in control. And when I say us, I'm talking about the entire city and county. Right now, we're beholden somewhat to developers, builders, and kind of following and directing their goals and their initiatives. I think with the Independent Housing Authority, we have the ability to identify and establish our own initiatives and move that ball forward. So with that, I'll let it go. I appreciate everybody's attention, and I'm very excited to look to hear questions and comments as we move forward.
Mayor, that concludes staff's presentation.
Yeah, and so since most of us, or most of you started at 5:30, let's go ahead and take our break right now, and we'll come back to council members' comments and questions we'll go ahead and say in 10 minutes at 8:02. And because I imagine most council members it's going to be 30 minutes to an hour on those comments. So let's go ahead and come back at 8:02. Let's go ahead and get started. We finished staff presentations, and now we're going to go to council's comments, questions, and direction. Councilmember Tessier.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate how the details and how the transition might work and the roles and responsibilities. Thank you, Cheryl, for your guiding light in all of this over the last 10 years. I wish you luck on your next endeavor. So I want to just kind of jump in what I support. The costs, it sounds like the costs are pretty, they're not exorbitant or permanent. So I do support if the city county building has some office space and whatnot that could be used for the ongoing efforts of the housing authority, that I would be in full support. Question, would it be fair to consider that some startup costs and might be a part of this? And after listening to a few different CHFA things, I noticed that there's usually some operational costs that are kind of given when they do an award. And I'm wondering if it would be appropriate to allocate like a operation fund or a startup cost, and looking at what CHFA does for $1 million projects. They usually do like a 400,000. So I'm wondering if a startup cost of around like 250,000 could benefit this particular housing authority.
Thank you, Councilmember Tessier. John Hall, Director of Economic Vitality. So should council provide direction this evening to move forward with creation of an independent housing authority, probably three things we would bring back to you. One would be proposal for changing the mechanism for appointing board members. Another one would obviously be to formally appoint board members. And then the portion that you're talking about relates to an IGA that would define the relationship between the city and the independent housing authority. And that would include things like the use of city staff for some period of time as staff to the independent housing authority, of office space, and the possibility of some startup funds depending on needs. So at a very minimal level, current staff could continue without additional funds to support the advisory role of the independent housing authority. However, if the housing authority wanted to go out, for example, and option a piece of property, that would require some funding, and that could be contemplated as well within the confines of the relationship identified in the IGA.
Thank you. So all the details will come later. So yeah, I definitely would support using the same committee members that we have. They've just been with us from the beginning, and I think they would transition to the board, the separate housing authority. I'm definitely for switching completely to the housing authority to take away any liability on the city, to move it to the housing authority, and to keep like a 5 to 7 member board. And I would also, let's see the other questions. Yeah, I think it would just be beneficial for council, for the authority to move quickly, because the properties are gone really quickly. And I appreciate Lee Applegate's being here. Thank you for your time and for your expertise. it's great to have someone of your status to help out Broomfield. So much appreciated. This has been a long time coming and a dream of mine. So I do hope my fellow council members will join me in supporting this and moving in the direction to the fully independent housing authority. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Jazierski.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with everything that Councilmember Tessier just said. I fully support creating an independent housing authority. I was in support of this 5 years ago, and I even support it more now. When I first got on council, I found it kind of strange that, that we sat on all these other different boards that we had very little training or expertise in. And it was my position that there were a lot of more qualified people in our community that could do this work. And I think I was very excited, and I can't believe it's been 5 or 6 years already since we appointed this Housing Advisory Committee. I feel like it was only a year ago or so. But I think they've proven me right that, that there are tremendous amount of knowledge in our community. And the committee has done a great job over the last 5 years, come up with a lot of great ideas. And I think there's a lot for them to continue to do. And for the reasons that Councilmember Tessier mentioned, I think it's important that they do get their own authority and independence at this time. Key points for me is that they, I know there's concerns about them binding the city, and as we've heard, that is not going to be the case. And of course, we are going to have, oversight over this board, whether it's through funding or specifically through the appointment and the potential removal of board members. And the removal part is the one point that I want to make sure that we do address thoroughly, because I would be concerned that could become a political witch hunt in the future. So I want to make sure that we have very clear rules as to what type of conduct would support the removal of an authority member. So that would be key to me. And then I don't know if this is a question, but certainly just a comment on funding. I would support some seed funding from the city. But the question I have, I feel like we have a lot of money that should be coming into the authority. I've seen some 7-figure cash in lieu promises, at least, that have been made, multiple over the last year or so. So I'm not sure if that is a source or could be a source of seed funding, or how much of this has actually come to realization at this point. But it seems like there at least should be a significant cash infusion from the various developments that have been doing cash in lieu as opposed to actually providing affordable housing. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Councilmember Winstead. Oh.
Thank you, Mayor. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Everyone's frozen, so I'll just go. I'll be really brief. I fully support the creation of the Housing Authority. I think this is long overdue. I support providing staff, office space, whatever resources needed, startup costs, and I look forward to seeing the specifics that staff bring forward. And finally, I'd just like to thank my Ward 2 colleague, Councilmember Tessier, for her relentless advocacy to bring this forward. So I look forward to seeing this on a future agenda item. So thank you, Mayor, and I hope you all can hear me. So
we did. Councilmember Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you to Cheryl St. Clair for your work and your presentation tonight. It's as Councilmember Tessier pointed out, this has been a long time coming, and I think that your work in continuing to be behind the scenes and working for housing and affordable housing here in Broomfield, but also at the state level as well. I've gone down to the State House with Councilmember Tessier and have seen her work, and I've heard her name in conversations regarding housing and affordable housing when she's even not in the room. So she is a champion for this in our community and at the state level. We're lucky to have her working on our team on our behalf. I really do hope that this council can see the creation of our independent housing authority, and I really do hope that it comes before Councilmember Tessier's time on council is up. So that, I guess I just threw out the gauntlet. Let's get it done before November. I also want to thank the tremendous work of our Housing Advisory Committee. This group of individuals over the years have really moved a huge rock down the road that, you know, the Housing Advisory Committee is a special group of people, and they have brought their expertise to this work, and they have brought their care and diligence to do it in both a thoughtful way as well as a way that has really motivated councils, both this council as well as previous councils, to action. So I appreciate all of your time, all of your diligence in this work. I think I'm walking into this process and into these next steps fully aware of the benefits and the concerns that have been laid out in front of us. I agree that we should be supporting the creation of our independent housing authority with startup costs and in-kind staff support. And I do look forward to that IGA coming forward to get this set up. So thank you again for all the work.
Councilmember Law Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I echo much of what has been said. I've been on this committee since the committee was first formed, however many years ago that was. And I very much appreciate all the hard work that's been done. I originally resisted this, and I'm still hesitant to create an independent housing authority. My main reasoning here is that I do want to make sure that City Council, as the elected officials, that we have accountability. We continue to have accountability over what's being done, kind of not exactly in our name, but certainly allied with what we do. So I will support this moving forward, so long as pertinent to Councilmember Jezierski's comments, I'd like to set up clear rules and expectations and very clear guidelines for what the housing authority is charged with, other than the state, the required charge, what we're looking for, what we're not looking for, because committees, in my experience, have a tendency to kind of go where they want to go. And it's not that I don't want them to pursue good things, but I think as the elected official, we have a responsibility that we have to make sure to ride herd, make sure that what we want to get done gets done, and that no other toesies are stepped on, no other boundaries are crossed. So I agree with Councilmember Jezierski very much that I don't want this to be a political football. This is a much needed service. But if I am going to agree to delegate part of my authority, then I absolutely want to make sure that there are guide rails around that as to what the committee is charged with doing, how we make our expectations clear, and the rules for potential removal off the board. I would even like to see, maybe for the first period of time, I don't know, first several years, that we reappoint once a year, so that we have council, I won't be on it, but council will have the opportunity to assess how the authority is progressing towards those goals, whatever goals we set, and how individual members are doing meeting those. I'd like to see some sort of a break-in period. Not that this committee doesn't do great work, y'all do. You know that. Alan, I can see you there. I don't know who else is on, Tony, Linda, everyone does terrific work, but I want to make sure that if I'm going to delegate part of my elected official authority, that it's done well and in service to the community and doesn't get off the rails. So I guess those aren't any questions, but those are my comments. Thank you.
Councilmember Lamb.
I generally support the staff bringing a draft ordinance and IGA forward. And then I have some for the Independent Housing Authority. And then I have some questions. In comparing the memo to the slide presentation, there were some inconsistencies in it that I wanted to clear up. So like on page 4, it said of the memo, it said the mayor appoints the committee and didn't add the council. And then on page 6, it said the mayor has the right to remove the committee members, but didn't mention the council. But yet on the slide presentation, it said both the council and the mayor appoint the committee. So I'm not, there were some inconsistencies and I wanted clarification on who's involved in that appointment and removal of the members.
Councilmember Lim, John Hall. I believe the portion of the memo you're referring to references state statutes. We can, of course, excuse me, we can, of course, add to what is a minimum under state statute to reflect the wishes of the council.
Okay. So my preference would be to have both the council and the mayor involved in the appointment and removal of the board members.
I think that almost goes without saying.
Okay, but it wasn't, it was different.
No, I hear you. I picked up on that too. Your point's well taken.
Okay.
I think the direction is that it'd be the mayor and the, the city council and the mayor. So.
Okay, that's great. Let's see. There was a statement that was clear in the memo and in the presentation that this housing authority would be subject to the rules and processes that were already in place with housing review in the city. What I was interested in was further implementations by this housing authority of council priorities. So what I was thinking of with my involvement and assignment to ACES with sustainability, there's not anything in place yet, for example, in Broomfield Municipal Code or in the planning department that formally sets sustainability guidelines, but yet council has that as a priority. So will the housing authority adopt council priorities as guiding principles? Like with sustainability, we could use DEAI as an example of that council priority and ask if the housing authority was going to implement that too.
Councilmember Lim, that would be something, those kinds of issues are things that we could articulate in the draft IGA for council consideration. So we could certainly bring forward those types of issues as part of that instrument and receive council's feedback at the time we will be requesting action.
Okay, that would be great. I would like to propose that those, whatever the council priorities are, should be strongly considered by the Housing Authority Board. Then that's what I would propose. And I had the same question as that Council Member Jezierski raised with, I'm in favor of supporting the initial cost of the Housing Authority Board and staffing from the city and that. But I was also curious if the cash in lieu contributions could be used to set up that board. And then in effect, it would, if you would use those cash in lieu contributions, I would think it could stimulate the speedy independence of that board from the city, which there seemed to be discussion in the memo that that's kind of preferable for getting loans and things like that. So, I'm not sure about the timing of when the board will be set up in conjunction with how much money has been contributed to the cash in lieu fund already, but it makes sense to me to try to use some of that cash in lieu money. I don't know.
Councilmember Lim, let me go back to the original question that Councilmember Jezierski posed. So presently we have a little bit over $1 million in the Housing Trust Fund from cash in lieu payments. We're expecting another $800,000. And yes, that could certainly be used to facilitate the independence of the housing authority sooner rather than later. I would, however, point out that the funding from that source is fairly lumpy. It comes in when development occurs. Actually, it comes in sometime after development may be approved to move forward. So there's some uncertainty associated with it, but hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, I guess I would like to know what is the what is the priority of the current experts in housing, I guess. Is the priority to be independent more quickly and use those cash in lieu funds to be independent? Or is the priority to keep those cash in lieu funds, flexible so that they can use it quickly to buy property? I guess that's the trade-off that I would see.
I would like to ask one of our housing advisory committee members, perhaps Tony, if you'd come back on to maybe talk about those trade-offs a little bit.
Thank you, John. Councilmember Lim, yes to both. We obviously haven't identified down to the dollar amount exactly what it's going to cost us to start up. We've had numerous people come to our committee and say, hey, you're getting all this cash in lieu money. Can you help us with this or that project? Until we actually have, I would say, a reasonable, I'm going to use the term bankroll, as soon as we get some money in that gives us some room to move a little flexibility, I think that we absolutely can use the cash in lieu funds to help us on an operational basis. However, what we don't want to have happen is we are, strapped. Yeah, we're independent, but we can't do anything. We want to be able to have a little bit of flexibility there in terms of leveraging those funds, yet still being able to do the functional things that the housing authority is intended to do. So I know I kind of gave you the vacation tour of my answer there. I apologize, long way around. But I do think that if we can have some type of a understanding between city and county and the housing authority that will enable us to, just have some air cover if we need the support. But, I'm sure we can come to an agreement between the two entities, part of the IGA, that says, here's how we can manage that process a little more effectively. But I would, as a member of the committee, I would absolutely support leveraging some of those cash in lieu funds for our operational, but we don't want to strap ourselves. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for that reply. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I want to start by saying that I also support, want to give credit to those that have worked hard on this issue. I generally support the Independent Housing Authority and appreciate the work of Cheryl St. Clair, Councilmember Tessier, the current Housing Advisory Committee members, and everyone who's, been moving the needle. And I want to, just to clarify, there's one of the benefits of the Housing Authority Board. And I want to clarify, because it wasn't noted on this slide, but these are volunteers, correct? Because that's a huge benefit.
Councilmember Anderson, yes, they are.
Okay, because I was, to have this entire board of volunteers, many of them experts, in my mind, that's a very great benefit. And in response to Councilmember Tessier's request to keep the current committee members, just quick, can this board be transitioned, or do we need to reappoint them?
We would need to reappoint them. I mean, I'll give that answer. We would have to go through an appointment process if we're setting up a new independent housing authority. So,
okay, that's what I was thinking. So they would all have to reapply then. Okay, and then I also support Councilmember Jezierski's concern over the clear guidance on the board member removal, and thank you that included the mayor and the council in those discussions. And then also there's the request for annual updates on progress. And I'm assuming that is this already in the ongoing discussions, like metrics to track and how we know we're being successful? Is that part of the ongoing discussion already?
Councilmember Anderson, yes, it is.
Okay. And then I also think it's important to see, as we're talking about these, the cost to transition to the independent authority. I think it's really important to see the cost delta, because there would be costs if it wasn't an independent authority. So, you know, how much more is that really costing us, or is it kind of the same? I think that's like a really important piece. And I also appreciate this discussion on the cash in lieu contributions as a funding mechanism, and that concern about being strapped for cash and that eventual transition over. So that was very helpful. And then I know we had the discussion earlier about retaining specific oversight in the draft IGA, and I'm just wondering if, I think this was addressed before, but can staff elaborate on the ability of the Housing Authority to borrow money and limits? Because I don't remember where this discussion occurred, but like there's a limit on how much money they can borrow, just like, you know, any other entity. If somebody could just quickly address that this isn't like a free for all. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, Councilmember Anderson. We were just discussing the best way to answer that question in this setting. We'd like to come back with a more detailed answer, but there would be limits on what can feasibly be loaned based on what a bank might consider to be appropriate for an entity of this type. But we can certainly come back with more specifics on that.
Thank you. And that is all my questions. And I look forward to moving forward with this Independent Housing Authority. Thank you.
Councilmember Groom.
Thanks. Yeah, I thank you, Councilmember Anderson, because I did have the question regarding the volunteer board. My next question is about the expenses. Other than the slight overhead, I'm assuming for some office space and expendables, is there any other expenses they would have other than the project themselves?
It,
Can you unmute?
I guess what I'm looking for as you get the microphone figured out is I wouldn't mind understanding the finance of this, because instead of taking money from our hard-earned developers, getting that cash in lieu and having a high over and taking from that money, I just want to make sure that this establishment is going to be kind of streamlined and not high overhead to make it operate.
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Groom. Early in the life of this Independent Housing Authority, they would be utilizing, for example, city staff. So to the extent that those staff were already accounted for in the city and county budget, there would be no additional cost. As the Independent Housing Authority begins to ramp up functions, then they would need to find revenue sources in our minds largely outside of the municipal budget to fund those resources. Although depending on how well the priorities of the city and county and the housing authority align, obviously there could be an opportunity, as Tony said, for the city to continue to provide some cover as it relates to the operations of the Independent Housing Authority. Capital costs are maybe a different issue.
Yeah, and that would be my next question. How do they create revenue? Because you would think that the revenue they create is Broomfield's revenue, as any kind of housing revenue comes in, that's Broomfield's capital revenue.
So there could be, Councilmember Groom, there could be multiple ways in which revenue is generated. Obviously, there are some sources of revenue that might come from grant funding. There are sources of revenue that could come from cash in lieu payments we've been talking about. Then in the next evolution or stage of growth for the Independent Housing Authority, they could acquire income producing properties which generate revenue, which is not an uncommon way for other housing authorities in the state to generate revenue at this time.
Okay, thank you. And then can you just explain the types of liabilities and risks? So we've been a part of the city for a really long time. What is any examples of a liability that risk that has come true or that's been an issue? I know a lot of this presentation relied on liability and risk being transferred from the city, but I didn't think that that was a significant issue for us.
Councilmember Groom, liabilities would look like things such as defaulting on a loan, liability arising from someone, say, slipping and falling on property that is owned by the housing authority and filing suit. So those kinds of liabilities.
Okay. So I guess some of my inputs is I definitely want to make sure that if we move forward, there's clear boundaries in the IAG of what the city and county, how we want them to shape the boundaries of this. What kind of properties we'd be interested in buying. Are we wanting apartment buildings to be purchased? Are we wanting to just buy facilities? Do we want to just have relationships with independent, private and oh, now I can't think of it. Where we buy the land and they might buy or build the facility. Those kind of things. I'm not quite sure if I am ready to say, yes, let's go out and start buying apartments and managing them. So I would be interested in talking more about those boundaries that we want to set forth. I kind of got a really leery about, I was all for this until I heard the words, they're completely independent with no oversight of the council. So I would like to have further conversations with that, but I know I'm running out of time. Yes to the startup efforts and the budgets, although I have heard some people say whatever it takes, but I don't want a whatever it takes budget. I do think we should give them a certain budget, a reasonable budget, and let them have a startup. And then I'm also interested in having the whole entity have frequent connections with the whole council and not just have two council representatives like we have on some of the other boards and commissions. I think it's really difficult for the whole council to stay in touch when there's only two council member representatives. So somehow structuring that for a whole council connection once a quarter or whatever that might be. And then I do highly hold in regard everyone on the current Housing Authority Commission, but I would like to see a reappointment to this new entity and not just transfer them all in. Just like we did with planning and zoning, I think there should be an application process and a reappointment and an interview setting for the new positions. So I did have a few more questions. I'm out of time. Thank you. I really appreciate everybody involved in putting this together. It's an excellent presentation and I look forward to moving forward with it. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. And I would like to start off by thanking Cheryl Sinclair and our amazing Broomfield Housing Advisory Committee who have not given up. They have persevered since I was elected in 2017, and I have supported all of their recommendations since day one, including this. I think this might be the last one of the recommendations that we so far have enacted. I think I remember looking at the housing budget the first year, and it was only community development block grant funds, which are federal funds, and they're very iffy. And I always wondered, like, what was this whole housing authority about? Because it didn't make sense for a part-time council that really didn't have that area of expertise to be in charge of this. It just makes sense to give people the resources to finally do something with the housing authority, because now we have a budget. We're getting funds. So I support moving forward with this. I know we have to work out the details of how it gets appointed. I would be in favor of something similar to what we did with our bifurcated boards for planning and zoning and land use and neighborhood board of adjustment. I know we have a lot of talent on that advisory committee that I hope we can retain. But I do think that we should do a little more thorough vetting to make sure we have all of the necessary expertise on the boards and more than a 6-minute interview, since we will be transferring a lot of authority to them. But I'm in total support. Thank you guys again. And that's all I have for now. I look forward to more.
Councilmember Hinkle.
Thank you. Thank you all for all of your input. And I remember being in church a long time ago, actually, hearing about how we're going to have affordable housing on our church land and how important it was to our community. And it really started grassroots. And it's taken a lot of effort and time to make it sort of housed underneath the city and county. And then from there, this really has taken off. And so it's just been a joy to see this as an outsider for so long and see it kind of grow within the city and county. I want to thank Cheryl and Sharon. You both have just been wonderful. And anyone who's been working on housing, I see you all, on this call. It's been a delight. And I am going to start to attend more meetings actually this year. So you'll see this face a little bit more. So hopefully we'll get a little bit more involved. I'm excited because I do want the current committee to serve as the actual housing authority. It is a low cost to CCOB if we use the housing fund and no liability to council and city when we go to this authority. I'm all about just checking in. We've done this for quite a while now as well with this crew. They've earned the trust of council. And so it's, about development, preservation, and purchasing. And so we do have oversight with council, so maybe an annual budget update. I agree with Councilmember Lim and just making sure that it's in our language that the mayor and council are involved in this. I think that's important. And I just want to know in the future, what does the process look like of applying to the board? I know that we can appoint, but I really would like to sort of flesh that out. If we have any thoughts about that now, that's great. Or if we just want to just say, hey, we'll work on that, I would just like to see that. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Councilmember Hinkle. We will be working on that and bring that back along with a specific appointment process for new board members.
So I had a couple questions, and because I'm looking at the slide that talks about the powers of a housing authority, and so the housing authority, if we create this independent housing authority with its own board, they have the ability to borrow in their own name, and and everybody's brought this up, and I don't have a problem with that. However, I think one of the things that crossed my mind was that like we've identified the need for what, 1,200 units of people that, like 30,000 to 40, pretty low. I guess I'd like the housing authority members, before we created it, to come up with what their goals are and what their business plan is to do that. Are they gonna build apartment houses, buy apartment houses, single family homes? And the other part about it is we're using the housing authority right now to give us advice on when Dillon Point, is built. Do you agree that we should have 10% units there? And so as opposed to, because I'm a little bit concerned about I'm concerned about wanting to create units and not having those affordable units throughout the town. I presume we could set some of those goals along with, with the housing authority that are our goal. But it just seems to me that we're going to give them that independent authority. There should be some type, and for lack of a better term, there should be some type of business plan on how we're going to achieve this, what type of debt we think we might incur in the first, and just say a 5-year plan what are your goals in those 5-year plans, you know, at least so we have some guidelines to understand that. And then that goes back to Councilmember Anderson's comment. Then we have the metrics. You know, that, you know, and I see council, you know, a lot of members of council, I mean, I'm 100% in favor of this. I just feel, you know, the accountability that Councilmember Lyons talked about really comes down to the Housing Authority says our goal is to create 300 units in the next 5 years, you know, or I don't even know what the numbers are. And that, you know, and to do that, we may want cash in lieu in certain places because we are going to look to you to look at some of these places. You know, I just want to understand how it all works. John, I'll make one comment that you'd mentioned the 800,000 that's coming in, but that can't include the 1.4 million we approved a week or so ago. So I think the number is a lot higher than 800,000 based on, you know, approved PUDs. And I'm completely in favor of having that, you know, I mean, I think that's the whole point of that, have this Housing Authority disperse those funds, but with some type of plan that we understand that might include borrowing and using rents to, but I mean, we're talking about a pretty big deal here. The more the Housing Authority can be specific on what their plan is and how, you know, and how they plan to use these funds directed them, the better off, you know, all of us are. But you got a lot, I mean, you know, John and Jennifer, you got a lot of guidance tonight, and Cheryl, thank you for your service. And Sharon, a special shout out to you, because, you know, I remember when you and I talked when you first got elected, and I said, you know, when I was mayor before, because you got elected just as I was terming out, and, you know, that, you know, because we were in a recession, these issues just didn't come up. And you know, it was a blank slate, and Cheryl was there, not doing a lot at the time, I think, because we had a different council. And but kudos to you, Sharon. What a great achievement. So I mean, I think you guys got your, Sharon, did you want to, Councilmember Tissy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think some of the things that's coming up for me, it's like, yeah, the housing needs assessment was definitely brought in. I'm sure that the Housing Authority would focus on that. I think there's so many different opportunities that could happen in the next 5 years that I don't want to necessarily limit what the opportunities are that could happen in the next 5 years. I think we need to kind of also wait and see what what opportunities are going to present themselves, and not necessarily say we're going to go straight for these opportunities when something else could be a more low-hanging fruit. So hopefully there's some leverage and some flexibility from you on the council with regard to what this 5-year plan will look like. And
no, I mean, there's no way that it can be specific, like, I'm going to develop software and sell it, there's no way it can be specific. But I would just like to have the Housing Authority, because you got a lot of expertise, talk about, give us examples of what they think would be considered successes. But I agree completely with you that my goal wouldn't be to, there's no way it can be that specific of a plan, but if you give council some ideas on when you might use borrowing, and, when you might just, I think the idea that you can borrow is a good idea, because I'm assuming every one of these projects would have, that we have would have some type of revenue associated with it, even at 30,000 level, and, income level. So, I just want more specificity, because what we've used the authority for, or the housing committee for in the past year and a half is give us advice on these projects that the free enterprise system has brought us. And you're talking about now having a whole new tool or belt that where the free marketplace, free enterprise is not meeting that market, our housing authority would try to achieve that. So.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. And so, I guess as is usual, I'll ask Jennifer, do you want to add, do you think you got the input you wanted tonight?
Yep, we sure did. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'm looking forward to, coming back, and I guess we have instructions that it'd be done by November 3rd or 4th or whatever date it is. So let's go ahead and move on to Broomfield County Commons Park. Which is our final agenda item this evening. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and staff will summarize and bring us up to date, give us ideas.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. We appreciate the opportunity. Chief Gary Krieger and Clay Shuck will be introducing us to this item. They have been closest to this. They've been working on it for a couple of months. We appreciate Councilmember Groom bringing this to us under a Section 18A and Council wanting to have some additional conversations. With that, Gary's going to kick it off first and then turn it over to Clay, and then we'll be open to questions. Chief?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Hoffman, and good evening again, Council and Mayor. Hopefully my internet connection, I've switched networks and it's going to be stable. So as we had a discussion a little bit earlier in the evening, you know, there's been a lot of outcomes with COVID that has made it difficult on our youth. And this has especially been true of teenagers and young adults because the modifications of the stay-at-home order that happened last June still did not fully open up opportunities for engagement and social interaction that's really important to our youth. And so they've been remote learning, their sports activities have been limited, arts activities have been limited, even recreational activities have been limited. So as a result, the kids have been gathering in non-traditional locations, most especially Commons Park, as you're fully aware. Since June of 2020, nightly gatherings of the youth and young adults, and they'll range anywhere from about 16 up through about 22, has negatively impacted the surrounding neighborhood, resulting in about 158 complaints as of when we turned in this memo. There's been a few more since then, surrounding unsafe driving, underage drinking, noise disturbances, and littering prior to the park closure, which is currently 11 p.m. In response, the PD has delivered more than 5,100 minutes of directed patrol time using our traffic unit SROs and our patrol officers to try and address these issues in the park. Additionally, the Parks Department Public Works have added speed tables in the parking lot, variable message boards requesting consideration be given to the neighbors by the kids, and increased trash collection. We've tried to evaluate other solutions, and many of them we determined would be of limited value, cost prohibitive, or just disruptive to other park users. So the dedicated police presence, in other words, instead of just as we can find the time and get our officers in there, which they are there quite a bit, in order to completely eradicate this problem, as it probably is going to require more dedicated service. Unfortunately, resource availability and increased crime, mental health calls for service involving weapons are competing for the time of our officers. The PD deploys its patrol officers on 4 shifts. The standard 3 shifts, days, swings, graves, we maintain a minimum number of officers and a supervisor. The 4th shift, or kind of a jump or overlap shift, we staff it as best we can based on officer availability. But we are required to use that shift to help us with the Flatirons area, which is one of our higher call load areas. The dedicated specialty units like traffic SROs and detectives are scheduled based on caseload, school schedules, and traffic patterns. So it may seem kind of strange to you that we account for the amount of time the officers have been in the park using minutes. For patrol officers, their day is accounted for in one of 2 ways. One is committed time, and that committed time is answering calls for service. Citizens call asking for assistance. It typically increases about mid-morning, with the exception of, the morning rush hour, especially during inclement weather periods, and continues to increase, with the highest call load being generally between about 5 p.m. and 11 p.m. It does go a little later on weekend nights and holidays. Uncommitted time is the time between the last call for service they answered and completed to the next one they're dispatched to, and it comes in minutes. So that's where we use that time to do directed patrol, traffic enforcement, and other proactive policing efforts, and then we track that. Again, as the call load increases through the day, the amount of uncommitted time decreases if they're an inverse relationship. Typically, the time of an officer is evaluated in minutes, obviously based on this continually changing dynamics and calls for service. Especially between 5 and about 11, a lot of times we will find that we have more people requesting services of the officers than we have officers available to immediately respond. In that case, we use a call prioritization methodology, so we're ensuring that our emergency response times remain as fast as possible. We had a discussion a few months ago about PD staffing, especially post-COVID. And as we discussed that, I had outlined for you that, thank you for the next slide, that it takes about 18 to 14 months to hire and train a police officer. That's why the police department is continuing hiring. We don't generally hire in batches. As soon as we have an opening, we start the process to hire, because during that 8 to 14 months, you can have additional attrition and it starts to compound on you. We did experience some attrition through retirements and resignations in late 2019. We'd actually planned to send a group of officers, about 6, to the academy that was starting shortly after the first year. Unfortunately, the stay-at-home orders prevented the academy or any hiring to be done until later in the year. And then, as you recall, as we moved out of stay-at-home in June, Council was gracious enough to authorize the 10 additional officers that were originally in the 2020 budget to meet increased population and service demands. So we have provided the table. You can see the authorized staffing, and as those numbers increased based on the budget. And then we also showed you the vacancies and the number of officers in training. The bottom line is really the one that's key, because you can see what officers are actually available for assignment throughout the operations side of the police department. This does not account for officers that are sick or injured, on family leave, or obviously we have significant training requirements that we must meet. All that has to be built into the time of these officers that are available staffing. We have been doing a lot of hiring. We hired the first group beginning in July of 2020 with 8 new officers. Those officers were hired July, August, and went to the police academy. They graduated in January, and last week became available for us to actually assign to patrol. But we're still having to backfill detective positions. Our detective division is got a backlog of cases because of the closure of the courts that we're trying to work through and file those cases. We need to backfill traffic. We have 1 SRO position open. And then I'm having to dedicate more resources to increase concealed carry permits. We're constitutionally required to issue those within 90 days. And since COVID, we've seen a 60% increase in applications for those. We did add 2 lateral officers that didn't need to attend the academy. They're shorter to train, and they're recently completed their training. We had a discussion about crime rates previously. You were provided a summary of the crime rates. We talked about the closure of the jails and those kinds of things ultimately resulted in an increase in crime rate. And I kind of laid this out in this graph where you can see kind of how the crime rate was managed with, the enforcement of laws. And then when that dropped right at the stay-at-home period, the crime rate started to climb. And unfortunately, that continues into 2021. Again, ours mirror those. Brookfield's crime rate is generally property-related crimes and mirrors those throughout the metro area in the country. For us, violent crime is not something that's really increased for us like it has in most major cities across the country. We are seeing the public health orders that we can open the jail. However, as we sit today, we still have limited availability because we're still required to quarantine all new entries into the jail. And that's about we have reduced that to a 10-day period with the assistance of public health. We are trying to secure the vaccines. Because of the limited amount of time somebody spends in the jail, an average of about 21 days, the Pfizer and Moderna are not good solutions for us. So the J&J vaccine is really our viable option, but it will have to be voluntary on the part of inmates if they want to take them. If you go to slide 3. Comments that complaints of traffic and juvenile issues continued, but the efforts by the PD has obviously declined those, and I showed you those call requests from citizens on this graph here. Still, as you can see, when we made a comparison to other parks in Broomfield, that Commons Park is significantly higher than the problems we're seeing in the other parks. We've also dedicated significantly more resources on patrol to try and address this, but any large numbers that we can really up our patrol staffing will not be available until about December. We have currently 10 officers in the academy. They're scheduled to graduate this month. They will then start into their field training program. Leaves us with five more openings left to bring us to full staffing, and we will hire those in the next month or so. Again, the detective caseload, just to give you an idea, we normally have about 150 active cases assigned to detectives at any given time in a normal period. That currently sits at 300 and climbing. Our traffic unit has been extremely busy. We've all been aware of some of the traffic issues with street racing, disregard for traffic laws, and some of the road rage we've seen. So far, our traffic unit, I think, has investigated 5 fatal accidents in the city and county of Broomfield. That's a significantly higher number than we see in a normal 12-month period. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We did a comparison for you to show the relationship of Commons Park to other parts of the city as far as demand areas for police services. You can see where the higher demand is for police services in the as the shade of color goes more from yellow to red, and then the green is the lower areas, and then anywhere where there's not a color, we typically are not seeing a lot of need for police services. So if we could go to the next slide. So I'll have Clay go through what they're seeing in damage to the park, but we're going to outline some options for you. We did in your council memo to provide more continuous coverage from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m., which I think will significantly reduce the problems, although there is going to be, I'm going to have to pull from other resources. So obviously one would be use the traffic unit to provide that coverage 7 days a week. But traffic accidents during the evening rush hours may surpass our available officers and patrol to be able to handle it. And we may need to issue or initiate a non-response similar to what we do during accident alert periods. We may have to either reduce or eliminate our participation in the Metro-wide street racing task force. I think we provided you with kind of an update on our efforts, but it takes a vast amount of resources coordinated across the metro area to effectively deal with those. And if we use the traffic unit, if there's a fatal accident, we will have to pull them out of the park and respond to the fatal accident because they have the specialized training to investigate those. We can reassign our SROs to provide continuous coverage. We'll have to use the SROs that are remaining in the schools to cover more schools, and with graduations and year-end events, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. We may not be able to provide the coverage the schools have normally hoped for from us. And we can reassign some people from the Flatirons area service unit, but that unit is already well below staffing, and there may not be enough to provide the overall coverage that we'll need. So we may have to go back to one of these other units. And as you saw from our heat map, this is an area that is fairly busy. And so that unit assists the patrol officers assigned in that area in addressing the calls for service and citizens' requests for service. So now I'll just turn it over to Director of Parks and Recreation, Clay Shuck, to talk about the damage.
Thank you, Chief. Good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. Clay Shuck, Director of Parks, Recreation, and Senior Services. So park systems locally, regionally, and nationally have really seen an increase of usage over this pandemic. And the impact of that usage throughout my colleagues that I talked to has been excessive trash, dog waste, and vandalism. The Park Service Division saw a 70% increase in vandalism between 2019 and 2020. These incidents of vandalism have included graffiti, damage to restrooms, art sculptures, and other amenities, such as the fishing dock out at Anthem. And I know you all are aware of that situation, and that we eventually had to close down the dock at Anthem Community Park. So this is consistent with what other staff are experiencing at a regional and national level. In a recent survey completed by an organization, Leave No Trace Behind, they asked the question about what was the impact on lands that we managed during COVID. 42% of the respondents, and this was a national survey, listed trash as an extensive or severe impact. The Park Services staff spent approximately 6,300 hours on trash collection in 2020 across the park system. 640 hours were reported at Commons Park, and approximately half of those hours are for the Yellow Pod region that we're discussing this evening. Staff has researched a number of possibilities to mitigate the usage of the impact in the Yellow Pod area, to include shutting down the Yellow Pod. The various options have included a full closure to the Yellow Pod, limited access, speed tables, and the installation of cameras. The option to close the Yellow Pod in the evening using a barrier would involve on-call staff coming to close gates and secure the area. The staff cost was estimated at approximately $75 in overtime per day times 365 days, which equals $27,375. We've also received suggestions to place signage that the Yellow Pod parking lot is closed at sunset or at a designated time. The enforcement burden would then fall on the Broomfield Police Department, and the concerns that Chief Krieger has already addressed. One concern for making this area off limits is that ADA parking for the dog park would be included in that closure. If we're only closing the parking lot, the dog park would still be available for use until 11 p.m. per park hours. So we would not have ADA accessible parking adjacent to the dog park. Currently in our park code, a park is defined as a park, playground, recreation facility, or any other open space. So as we talk about changing hours or the option of changing hours within the code, it would apply to all those areas. And currently, under the code, we can close a portion of the park to the public if necessary. But again, as I discussed, that has some unintended consequences. We looked at our surrounding organizations and agencies and did a survey of what time they close their parks. For the most part, it was between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. in the evening. There was only one respondent that said the parks vary per park location. That concludes my portion of the presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Chief Krieger.
And Jen, do you want to kind of close this out?
Thanks very much. We appreciate both of you. Mayor, that concludes the staff presentation. I know that's a lot of information. There's, I'm sure, additional questions. There was some emails that came in. Gary and Clay did their best, as I was noting, to address those recommendations in their presentations. So why don't we go back to you, Mayor, and we'll field council member questions.
Let's go to council member questions, comments, directions, requests. Councilmember Groom.
Sure. I just want to say thank you very much for all the extra time it took to put this together, and all the extra time I know that our police officers have spent over there to help out. A few questions. I know we've talked about the videos or the cameras, and that the technology might not be available for nighttime, but if it's closed around nighttime anyway, if we're talking summer, what would be the expense of something like that? And maybe not connected to our emergency response, but at least a 24-hour video that if something happened, it's something we can go back and try to investigate at least and have on record?
So it's not only the cost of the video. So when we looked at putting the video cameras out there, there's currently no network out there. So we'd have to build a network that would actually capture and hold the video. You've got to keep in mind that then somebody has to watch the video. So there would be the staff time it takes to actually watch the video and try to identify who was responsible. We are, again, we are as the police department required to make a proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So a car, even if we can get a license plate, is not enough. A car cannot commit a crime. We actually have to identify the person behind the wheel at the time the crime was committed. And that's pretty difficult using, the reasonable close video cameras for this purpose.
Thank you for that. So even if we could identify the car, you can't hold the individual that owns the car responsible because you can't identify who is driving it.
Yes, and again, an object can't commit a crime. Only the
Sure.
person who's actually operating that vehicle could be held accountable for that.
So what happens if you said your car was involved in committing a crime? Were you driving it at 7 a.m. because it was on video? Do they just say no and you walk away?
If they said no, sure. If they said no and we couldn't go any farther with it, that would be the case. Keep in mind that's all an officer response investigative follow-up that has to be done, and we're already working on all these cases like auto theft and burglaries and all those kinds of things. So it's staff intensive to do it, and that's why the alternative of just putting an officer there is actually probably a more effective and quite honestly cheaper alternative, because they can stop it right when it occurs.
Got it. All right, my next question is probably for Mr. Shuck. On page 7, there's a picture of the Commons Dog Park parking lot. It looks like, and it's got blue circles. Is that a place where we could close the parking lot down? Is that just that section of it? Because that's kind of where we're having problems.
So we've identified 2 options for potentially closing and placing barriers to close the parking lot. And yes, Councilmember Groom, that is one of those options.
And so you're saying basically at 5 o'clock, we would need to go out there and shut them down? Or I didn't understand about calling in on-call, off-call duty employees.
Yeah, so when we're discussing this closure, if we're going to use any type of barrier, a chain or a gate, if we do it either at the front entrance, right before the dog park, or at the area that you're suggesting, we would have the on-call person come in. Depending on the time of the year, would be dependent on if they were on call. So if they're on call, we're calling them in to close it down. So then they would be on overtime at that point in time on call status. So most of the time our park staff are working the regular shifts from 7:30 to 3:30. So if we're closing a park at 4:30, anywhere till 9 o'clock, then we're estimating that we would call in that on-call person and to close it down, or keep them on duty, which again, we would still be in an overtime situation to close down these park areas.
So
I think also, if you look at those, the blue circles are also where the 2 speed tables currently are. And then the picture below on page 7 is a potential other place that speed tables could be placed as well.
yeah, but the speed tables, the blue ones, they're currently there, but we're still having a lot of the trouble because they still go in there and litter and do their thing.
The blue circles, Councilmember Greer, are the proposed speed tables, the next round of speed tables. The red circles are the current speed tables.
Current. Oh, okay. But if we did the blue tables, if we did the blue circles and we shut them down, would that still allow handicap parking at the dog park?
Yes, it would. So just adjacent to the east of the top blue circle is a couple of handicap parking spaces, I believe.
Okay.
There are some on the east, on the west side as well, but I take that back. I think the handicap parking spots are both on the west side of where that blue circle is, not the east side.
Oh yeah. I see them. I see them. So that still would not. I mean, we could make new ones, right?
Yeah, we would have to work with traffic engineer and determine where we need to re-implement those.
And just to clarify, we would be shutting the park. Let's just say we shut the parking lot down at 3:30. With paid staff. It would just be the parking lot. We would just say no cars are allowed to use this parking lot. So people could still use the field and people could still use the dog park.
That would be true. And higher use times, especially during the summer, there is a significant amount of use of that upper parking lot. So it really depends on what option we chose to shut down the parking lot and place barriers.
Okay. So I guess with all the options, and I'm getting the 1 minute mark. What is your recommendation, since you've been very involved in this, and I know that you get just as many emails from the residents that I'm sure Councilmember Anderson and I do. I mean, I can tell you that I feel just as hopeless I'm sure you do in solving this issue. I know that these are things that we've talked about before. I'm getting the feeling that there's nothing we can do. I was hoping to have having more of a conversation about if there was a money bucket that you had, what would you recommend?
Thank you, Councilmember Groom. So I think the balance here is the balance of the various user groups and what impact we're going to have on the community overall. So if we're trying to resolve a problem with youth gathering at night and we decide to close that area, it does impact other uses, rentals of the pavilion, use of the dog park, those, so legitimate uses as well. So I don't believe there is just a one option that we can go with to resolve this. I think it's a combination of things. And I think some of that is that awareness piece and working, if we can, try to figure out who some of these youth are and working with them also to identify, hey, how can we help reduce this and reduce the impact on the neighborhood? I think anytime we talk about closing down a park facility, it really is impacting the greater community. And that's the overall concern of how to do that and balance all the users.
Got it. And I'm just proposing to shutting down the parking lot, just to clarify, not necessarily the park itself, but I understand that impacts the facility. So I'll be interested to see what the other council members have to say. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Mr. Mayor, I think you're calling me, but you're muted.
I'm calling you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Chief Krieger and Clay for being here, and Officer Goodall. Goodell, I appreciate you being here. A lot of work went into this, and I totally understand why you brought this forward, Councilmember Groom, and understand how the residents are a little, are concerned. I'm really interested because I feel like this is specifically COVID related. I feel like when COVID is gone, like when we are over the hump of COVID, I think this problem will disappear. I also think that the police have been doing, exactly what they need to be doing. I really do not want to micromanage how the police do their work. I also think this is a really big opportunity for maybe the neighborhoods to collaborate. I mean, we just heard the first study session item was all about mental health, was all about creating safe places for youth to hang out. And my conversation earlier today with the communities that care, having close access to safe spaces in the community associated with lower risk of substance abuse. I will forward this information to the council. Adolescents who frequently use alcohol and marijuana don't necessarily have a safe space at home. So I think there's opportunities for this community maybe to kind of take that place back. Maybe there's barbecues, maybe there's places of worship that we could connect with to have gatherings or appropriate gatherings that would allow for, I see many priests, pastors, sisters, nuns going into areas where there's considered trouble, and they set up a space for food and provide music. And it's just that if you're going to be here, you're going to be here for the right reasons. I don't want to shame and blame our youth. I want to create spaces for them. And I do not want to close the park down. I don't want to close the parking lot down. The accessibility and inclusivity and all of that is definitely an issue if we close that down. Not only that, I feel like this would just move to another park, and we'd have the same things. And so I don't know if there is a good solution other than maybe the timing of the restrictions lifting with COVID. And I really want to, I think Broomfield is better than punishing and closing stuff down. I think we can create more community. This is an opportunity for communities that care. I talked to them. They are willing to work with the Broomfield Police Department, maybe recreation, to see if there's other things that could be done. I don't want to invest time or money on security cameras or things like that for the reasons outlined by Chief Kreger and Director Shuck. So I will support what the recommendations from the police department are. I don't support the other recommendations at this time. So thank you. That is all.
Councilmember Lindstedt.
Thank you, Mayor. And I'm just going to leave my camera off because my internet is still very unstable, apparently. I'll just say I don't support pulling resources away from street racing, the street racing division, or from our serious crimes. We've seen a rise in all kinds of crimes, and I feel really badly for the neighborhood dealing with this, and I really don't know what the solution is, but we have a limit of, officers and resources, and I just can't risk pulling away, those resources from more serious incidents. And I'll just add that I'm highly skeptical of an elected body like the city council here directing where to police and how to spend and allocate those resources. I think I trust our police chief to make those decisions. So I don't know what the solution is. It's deeply troubling, this rise in crime across our community, but directing the police chief at this time from those other very important priorities I just don't think is appropriate. So that's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
Councilmember Hinkle.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for this input, and thank you, Chief Krieger, for being here, and Mark Goodell and Clay Shuck. And I just appreciate all the effort that it took to really analyze what the problem is. You know, and I know that we're realizing and we're looking at the enforcement issues, and that's your job, right? Like, you're part of the enforcement, but I know that what puts the strain on the enforcement is not doing enough prevention. So I remember being a kid and jumping off, I'm not kidding, jumping off the side of those Chatfield Dam places, like midday, and it was so much fun and it was so stupid. So I want you guys to know that these could be our future council members hanging out at night. Okay, I even walked like a stupid robot in the middle of the night. It was totally dangerous. You shouldn't do that. You know, and there's other things I probably won't even say publicly because they're just so stupid. But I just feel like these could be our future leaders. And I really feel like if we could ask the youth themselves, you know, what's going on? If we're asking the youth themselves, how can we make this better? I'm not sure what that would look like. But I think when youth sort of, you know, take charge of their surroundings, we see it happen all the time in high school. Peer-to-peer relationships and that influence really does help. And it also, you know, to Councilmember Tessier's point, is that we should create some sort of celebration of our youth, maybe, you know, more towards nighttime. And I don't know what that looks like and who we could reach out to, but let's celebrate them, because they have, honestly, I will tell you, my 16-year-old has gone to school every day with a mask on, and it's becoming very tiresome. And then my daughter has been at home most days during the year, you know, bouncing around because she wants to get outside. I mean, she wants to jump on that trampoline in the winter. It's very hard. She wants to get out and do stuff. So I really would like to take the pressure off of our police and our enforcement and really figure out some sort of way where we can structure a way for our teenagers to be teens. And to Councilmember Tessier's point too, is that I do think this is COVID related. So I want to see, have we asked the teens? Have we asked, you know, the people that are there in the middle of the night, what's going on? Have we done any of that? I'm just curious.
So interesting you should ask, and I'm going to ask Commander Goodell to sort of outline our efforts with his SROs and discussions we've had with the kids and kind of exactly what you just outlined, what we've been working with the kids. Most of the kids are pretty good. There are obviously, based on some complaints, some kids that are not as receptive as others are. Mark, you want to kind of give an outline of that?
Sure. Thanks, Mayor and Council. And Councilmember Hinkle, we've been out there a lot. We've asked those kids those questions, and a lot of times when we're out there with them, they're just hanging out. They're just friends are together. They're playing frisbee. They're being loud. They're being kids. Yes, they are leaving trash. Yes, sometimes they speed through the parking lot, and we deal with that when it comes about. But we've asked them, and they just tell us that everything's closed right now. There's nowhere to go. You know, the movies just kind of reopened. Even just kind of reopened. So hopefully, further in the summer, things will take off. But right now, they have nothing to do or nowhere to go, and so that's their safe space. As you guys have talked about, of having them there. My concern with moving them or shutting down the pod would be they're just going to move closer to the residents at Redleaf, to be quite honest, and use that parking lot. That's what they'll do, because they want to hang out, and that is a place, because the schools don't want them in their parking lots, right, on private property. We don't want them at Northmore Park, where it's in the middle of a community. So that's where they picked, and that's where they've been hanging out. But the contacts we've had with them have been great. We've had a lot of good conversations. We have officers out there as much as we can. The guys like talking to them. We wish we were there all the time so we can stop the noise and disruption for the neighbors. But for the most part, most of those kids are really good kids that are just hanging out and having fun and acting like teenagers.
Great, and I hope they see their police officers as somebody who supports them in this time of life right now. So that's important. Thank you. That's all the questions I have. I really appreciate all your work and effort. That's very important. Thanks.
Councilmember Jezierski.
Thank you. Very briefly, you know, I sympathize with the neighborhood there, but I also sympathize with the kids. It's been a tough tough year. And as the officer just mentioned, they're just looking for a place to go. So, perhaps when things start to open up more, as he said, maybe they'll be able to go to the movies or even to each other's houses, because I imagine a lot of that's been off limits over the past year. So, I don't support shutting down the park. I don't support shutting down the parking lots. As I think Councilmember Linston mentioned, I really would defer to our police and our parks on what the appropriate responses are. I guess from my perspective, beyond making sure an officer goes through there every so often, and certainly making sure that things are cleared out by 11 o'clock at night. I'm not seeing much more beyond that. I guess comes to mind education. I think that was mentioned related to the trash. That could be it's a nuisance at the very least the next day. So hopefully at the very least we can go ahead and let the kids know that clean up after yourselves, or the good thing you have here could be taken from you. So hopefully at least we can get that under control. So and okay, nothing further. Thank you.
Councilmember Lyles, I don't ever have kids down here. I have kids down here.
Fair enough. I hope that they're behaving themselves given the discussion. Presumably they are.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. Sorry. Trying to be humorous didn't work. My apologies.
I thought it was funny as heck.
I appreciate this discussion. I guess I don't know that there's a teenager on the planet that when you say, hey, what are you doing out here? Why don't you go somewhere else, that says anything other than, oh gosh, there's nothing to do, there's nowhere to go. That's just part of being a teenager. So they will go somewhere. And I do think this probably is related to COVID, but that doesn't mean that they have to be super loud or destructive or leave their trash around or bother the neighbors to all hours. And I think that, okay, what I'd like to see happen is a relatively short burst of enforcement, maybe, where for a month or into the middle of June, we have the PD go through there very frequently and or close the park a couple of times, something like that, to send them the message that Councilmember Jezierski was talking about. I think that if we just go in and say, shake our fingers at them and say, hey, you silly kids, kind of like in the old Scooby-Doo shows, right? Hey, you pesky kids, if you don't behave, this could go away. I don't think that's going to have any effect at all. But I think if we make it go away for a certain period of time and then communicate our expectations effectively and follow up on that, we might have a chance. Because it isn't fair to the people that live in the neighborhood nearby. It isn't fair to them either that they should have to go through every weekend from now until the kids find someplace else to go congregate or until COVID's over. It's not fair to the neighborhood either. And I think it is part of our responsibility, maybe not to micromanage, but to take control of the situation rather than letting teenagers who are doing things that nobody really likes except the teenagers, but that are clearly destructive and potentially harmful and whatnot. It's up to us to be literally the adults in the room and put some boundaries on this, set some reasonable boundaries, communicate reasonable expectations, and follow through. So I guess I'd like to hear the chief talk about, could we do like 6 weeks of shut things down and communication, effective communication, and then say, look, we're going to open it back up, but if you're crazy like you were before, we'll shut it down again. Chief?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Councilmember Lyons. So my proposal with those 3 alternatives where I'm going to have to pull those resources from are exactly that. We would do it for probably more of the month of May, because when we got started into June, now I'm hit with vacation times. We've got a lot of training coming up that is mandatory that we have to get accomplished. So I'd have to pull that traffic unit, the SROs out of the schools. is really my two alternatives to give you that 4 weeks of more concerted enforcement. You know, we haven't, when we arrive, we're just not seeing the problems. We do see a little bit of trash. We have been giving the kids gift cards and they help us clean it up. You know, we're just not seeing it. But to be fair, you know, when we get a call or even when we get there, they're seeing us coming, right? Because they see us coming down Sheridan. So they know when we're arriving. So they know when to probably act better.
Yes.
So really that's really the alternative from the police department standpoint. I mean, we are your police department. We can solve this problem for you. But my limited resources on patrol, I've pretty much given you all the available time that they have and still deal with other traffic complaints through the city and other, you know, things that we need to be taken care of. So my only alternative right now with my available staffing is to redirect one of my specialized unit, and there's an impact from that. And that's kind of what we're seeking for council's direction on.
Fair enough. Well, that would be my preference. I guess, Chief, I would also like to, and this is not a conversation for tonight, but I'd also like to see you come back then. If we need more resources, more police resources in the city and county, I would like to, well, probably I'm not going to be on council when that budget is approved, but I'd like to have that proposal come back to us. It does seem like, it feels to me like maybe we need more officers or more resources in one sort or another, and I would welcome that discussion.
Yes, thank you. It actually isn't about the authorized staffing, which council was very gracious to add in the last 2 years. It's about available, which right now with all the hiring and training we're doing, that's where we're getting caught. And I always hate to go, you know, to wait too long to hire somebody because it compounds through that 8 to 14 months. So we really try to hire immediately and keep people moving. But we got 6 months behind in COVID, and it's taking us until December to be caught up. But all things being equal, and God forbid any other kind of shutdowns or anything, we really feel by December we will, you know, have all those officers in the right places. And if this was happening a year from now, I would have a lot more resources and wouldn't to dedicate to this problem, and really wouldn't be as pinched as we are right now.
I appreciate that. I just want to make sure that you and your staff know that you're well supported, not only by the community, but by council, and that if there is more that needs to be done, that you bring that discussion forward. Okay, Mayor, I think that's all I have.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Oh, I thought it might be me. Thank you, Mayor.
It is.
And I appreciate the time and resources that went into explaining the issue and what's being done to mitigate the impacts. And I completely hear the residents, and I empathize. Living next to an open space or a park or even a golf course comes with a cost, I've learned as well. And the screeching golf carts when my windows are open pretty much annoy me all summer long. Well, all year long, because the golf course is open all year long. But I mean, I don't want to play it down. Part of me is like Councilmember Henkel. We did all these things, but in Louisiana, we had the woods and we were in the middle of nowhere. So nobody even knew where we were. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is part of growing up, you know, testing the limits. And I do appreciate everything you're trying to do, Chief Krieger and Mr. Shuck and Mr. Goodell. And I'm not going to tell you how to do your job either. My faith is in you. This is your process. And we're more of the policy arm of this government. So I trust you to keep doing what you're doing to the best of your ability. Thank you. Oh, I did have one question. Have you found, because you're obviously stepping up a lot of patrols in that area, have you found that sometimes your officers will be on the site and you'll get a call for noise or speeding, but the officers aren't seeing it or hearing it?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Yes, we have had that experience. In fact, I was right next to the park on 2 occasions last week. but it's a big area. And so there could be a delay in time between the time that the neighbor called in. You know, depending on how busy dispatch, it could have taken a few minutes to dispatch it, and the car or whatever had left. You know, as far as the noise goes, it's really hard for us because it is the park, and parks are expected to have noise. And so it's hard to target these kids' noise with the park being open till 11, and yet you have other people, you know, that are using the park and making lots of noise. We do sweep the park every night at 11 or as closely thereafter as we can get officers to make sure they are gone by 11.
Could it be that they're hearing the traffic on Sheridan?
It certainly is possible. I would not be able to say definitively, but there's, as all of us know, street racing has been a big problem in the metro area, and we're hearing it all the time in all of our major streets, especially highways.
Well, I want to thank you for your crackdown on the racing as well. And I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I also appreciate all the effort that has been done to try to enforce the behaviors in this park. I want us to go back to when the Anthem dock was closed with fencing and then there's cement blocks put up. There were still youth accessing the dock. They were just climbing around it, despite how dangerous that was. And they continued to use that dock for a period of time, but then it just sort of stopped. Do we know what happened there? Like why the youth just left that location? Was it enforcement, or did it just naturally happen? And I also want to note that I don't think this ever occurred, but the moms in Anthem Highlands were so frustrated over what was happening at that park with these large youth gatherings that they were already grouping together and planning to go and start hanging out in the dock before the youth got there and take it back and make it their spot. I mean, that was to the point where it got to, and I really want. That kind of goes to Councilmember Tessier's input, you know, of having these community groups get involved and do that support. But if we're going to go that route, I really want to make sure that we put a full concerted effort into that. But do we, Chief Krieger, do we know, did the dock dissipation, was that enforcement, or just naturally happen?
I think it was steps that the Parks and Rec Department took. So I'm going to defer to Director Shuck, if you don't mind.
Oh, thanks.
I don't think I have a clear answer on why it finally ended. I mean, it kind of organically worked that way, but I think putting up the barriers and continuing putting up the barriers for the dock use led to finally either stopping that activity or moving to a different location.
Okay, so potentially if we did some form of like the speed bumps or something, maybe we could deter it enough to get them to move on, but it would be a different type of closure. Okay. And then this is a question, I think, for Chief Krieger. There was in the presentation from the Red Leaf community put together a presentation, and they had in there concerns about drug dealing, where they were seeing, you know, a car that stopped there, another car just for a short time, then they move on. Are the officers seeing evidence of this type of behavior? And is that what they suspect is going on? And is that any different than other portions of Broomfield?
So I'm going to again ask Commander Goodell, because it's his units. He's the watch commander during the night. He's out there quite frequently, and he's the one that assigns the officers out there. So he can kind of probably give you firsthand information about what we're seeing.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Councilmember Anderson. We're not seeing the drug use and alcohol per se with like the kids that are out there. But yes, we do get calls periodically that people say, hey, this is suspicious. 2 cars stopped up next to each other. And we think it's a drug deal. And if we have plates or we have something where we're in the area, we can, you know, try to contact them if we have enough information. We did, you know, 2 weeks ago, we had a DUI out there in the afternoon, but it was an adult. So we are out there, and there are, it's the same as other places in town. It's not any different than, we'll say, Midway Park or anywhere else where we get the suspicious calls of possible drug dealing or possible alcohol issues or things like that. But with the kids specifically, we haven't seen that at all. With all of our contacts over the last year, we haven't seen those. But, you know, they can see us coming, but we can smell things, and we haven't smelled anything. So the officers specifically try to find those things because the residents say they're happening and we want to find them and stop them.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And I know you'll continue to watch for it. So that is very helpful. And I thought the information on the cameras was helpful because that seemed like a great idea, but not understanding the network and the reviewing of the video and all of those pieces, and that it being dark at night. I understand that's more complicated than it seems. So I have a question about two of the possibilities regarding possibly putting speed bumps between the two parking lots to block off the west section. And understand that the speed tables are not as helpful. If speed bumps were put in place, from the perspective of our police department, would those speed bumps slow down the racing like we would want it to, or would it make it more dangerous because now you've got them speeding over speed bumps? Is that an absolute deterrent, or could that behavior continue and actually worsen? That would be my concern. Just love to hear some input on that one.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Anderson. You're exactly right. So speed bumps are really good at slowing down traffic that is marginally over the speed limit or marginally going too fast. But if you take a car that is going quite fast and hits a speed bump, you risk damage to the car, loss of control of the car, and with young drivers and a lot of pedestrians around, you could actually send that car out of control into the groups. And so that's always my concern, is they have a value to slow down some kids. We're not seeing a lot of kids speeding, but there are kids that do it clearly. But if a young driver hitting a bump, a table or a bump at sufficient speed to break an axle, or otherwise cause a damage to the car that would send that car out of control, could have some pretty dire consequences.
Okay, thank you. And then there was the possibility of closing the parking lot with cones or a chain or a gate, and two questions here. What if we send a staff member out to close the parking lot and there's still cars in the parking lot? Do they, I don't know what that looks like. Would they just willingly leave? I think we have to have assistance from the police department as they closed it. And then also, there was in this presentation from the community, could resident volunteers assist in the nightly closure, which still has that same concern? But maybe you could talk about that just a little bit.
So if we were to put some kind of barrier across to especially a gate, and there was cars still in the parking lot, somebody was out playing soccer on the field or whatever, we would have to come and unlock it and let them out when they were ready to leave, or the car would have to stay there. We wouldn't do that, but that, I suppose, is another option. Volunteers is a great thing, but if you have a volunteer that ends up having some kind of confrontation out there because somebody doesn't want to close, that has some risk to it too. So I don't know, Clay may have a better feel for that, and he does a lot of work with his park staff and volunteers in the parks.
Thank you, Chief. Yeah, thank you for the question, Councilmember Anderson. I would agree with the chief that we run risk with a volunteer out there trying to help to shut down that area. And again, that conflict piece, if we do have a car parked there, they don't want to move. We don't want that volunteer having to deal with that situation. So I think our preference would be to have staff involved with that. And then if we had our on-call person out there and we were having some type of difficulty, obviously we would contact the police department to come out and assist. So I think our preference would be for staff to do that task and not a volunteer.
Okay, thank you. And so would you feel confident if we were going to have staff close it, that if we send somebody out there and they could get assistance if needed? Yes, I still have concerns about the cars that are in that parking lot. And I also think, Councilmember Law Evans had noted about this period of stronger enforcement. And I was hoping that we would see some amazing solution that would just, solve this right here, right now, but it's not, it doesn't look like there's one thing that's going to work, but that the strong period of enforcement, I honestly think that's about our best option at this point in time, or else there has been this discussion that, these hangout locations have just not been open, but we're seeing things open now. And this is a conversation that we have to revisit in a few weeks if it doesn't dissolve as these hangout places will open up. I'm not sure. I really want to do something for the Red Leaf neighborhood. Beyond just that, the stronger enforcement, understanding the staff constraints, I'm not sure that the cameras and the speed bumps or any of these options are going to actually work. So I guess I'll leave it at that. But
and Councilmember Anderson, we've always felt that as the restrictions lifted and the options became greater, the kids, there's more to do other places than just hang out at the park. That's the best place because there's not a lot going on. And, as school ends and, kids start doing their summer activities and stuff, we're hoping that it starts to dissipate. We have seen a decline in the problems out there since the high in December and January. But also, we will certainly have an opportunity to then use the SROs that are off in the summertime to give us a little bit more enforcement and coverage out there once graduations and all that occurs. But that's still probably, a good 3 weeks away or maybe slightly more.
Yeah, but 3 weeks isn't that far. 3 weeks it'll come quickly. So I think that's really the best option is that stronger enforcement, and my time is up, but I would love to see what happens if we do get some volunteer organizations out there like Councilmember Tessier suggested. So thank you very much for this discussion.
Councilmember Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation on this. It's a positive that there's a reduction in the amount of calls coming in concerning complaints about the negative activities in the park. Is this reduction due to reporting fatigue and caller fatigue, or is this an actual reduction in activity in the park?
Thank you, Councilmember Schaaf. It's impossible to know because we were trying to predict what didn't happen. But we have obviously spent a lot of time out in the park, so we're there as frequently as we possibly can. But if it's call fatigue or it's actually a reduction in problems, both are certainly possible.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there's a fair number of community members that are listening to this study session item tonight that have been affected by this, and I'd be interested to hear their feedback on this if they've just kind of have seen this as an issue where they call and nothing is done, and so they've now given up on calling. So I'd be curious if that's part of it, or if this is actually there has been a reduction in that some of these practices that you all have been doing are actually working, and there is a reduction in those negative impacts happening. My second question is there a trend with days or times for this activity in the park?
It's pretty much every day, but Commander Goodell, you want to maybe provide some more input on that?
Councilmember Schaaf, can you repeat that question for me, please?
Yeah, I was just curious, is there a trend with days or times for this activity happening in the park?
It's pretty much, we get called 7 days a week, depending on weather. Friday and Saturday are more of a hangout because there's no school. But there's a lot of online kids right now that are hanging out there on Wednesdays and Thursdays as well. So our calls come at various hours. Sometimes they come at 7, sometimes they're at 11. But we're pretty good at 11 o'clock of getting everybody out of the park. That's everyone knows that we'll get them out so we don't have any more issues. And then throughout the night, we drive through there. But there's no particular time for any of these calls.
Okay. I really appreciated that you talked about having conversations with these young people and I sympathize with them when they say that there aren't any places to be. I totally agree with that. So I'm curious, are any of these conversations, do they allude to CCOB programs that aren't currently in place at this point that they may not be able to participate in?
Councilmember Schaaf, I haven't heard of any asking or reaching out for those different programs. But you did just remind me, another council member asked earlier what kind of conversations we have with the kids. But over the last month, we have had conversations with the kids every night when we're out there talking to them about, hey, if you guys can continue to play loud music, drive, crazy around the park, it may be closed. And so I think some of them are listening. And and seeing that, you know, the bond between like the police and us out there just talking to them like normal kids and getting them to pick up trash of other people and help us, you know, keep our community clean. We are continuing to do that. But yes, your question, I've never heard or had any officers tell me that they're asking about specific programs.
Okay. I mean, it seems like this, you know, the solutions to this problem, this issue, isn't really just a responsibility of the police department and the Parks and Recreation department to solve. You know, this is really a community issue. It's going to take, you know, parents and neighbors to have conversations with these young people. You know, and to that point, you know, while there are a large number of calls for this park, is this activity unique to Broomfield County Commons, or is this sort of activity happening in other parks, maybe to a lesser degree or a greater degree?
Councilmember Schaaf, we're not having these issues in other parks right now. At one point up there in Anthem, we did have problems with kids up there hanging out a lot with swimming in the pond up there, and we had to shut down the area that Director Shuck was talking about. And I think that they just moved to a different area now, some of those kids of where to hang out. Since we solved that problem and moved them down, I think as part of it to the Commons is what we did.
Okay. Well,
Councilman, if you don't mind me answering a little bit.
No, go for it.
Well, so part of the Carl Parks and Recreation Association directors section, we've had conversations related to this, and there are other areas within the region that are experiencing the same type of thing, and honestly dealing with the same type of conversations on how to mitigate and resolve the issue. And so it is happening more than just within Broomfield.
I appreciate that. And, you know, I figured we weren't in a unique situation on this. But, you know, with that said, I do look forward to a ride along this summer with an SRO to, you know, figure out what or to see what the nightlife looks like these days. So I look forward to that. Thank you so much.
You know, that's a good segue into what I was going to say. You know, when I did my ride along, we went through the park, and you know, I forget when we did that. It must have been last May or so, and you know, and the kids tend to congregate on the far west part of the park. Is that still true, Commander?
Yes, it is, Mayor. It's in that up there by the dog park is where they all congregate on that.
But towards the restroom part, I mean, like I'm just looking at the
Right.
distance from, you know,
Closer to
because my
Sheridan.
other observation of it was that they're right on Sheridan, and so there's something good about that. These kids are hanging out in a place where, you know, there's gonna be a lot of people seeing them, and so I mean, it just seemed to me, I understand the neighborhood's complaint. The question is what we can do about it. I just make the comment that they seem to be, at least that night, they were hanging out pretty much near where the restrooms were on the west side of the park. They were on Sheridan, so how rowdy they could get is somewhat a function of, traffic on Sheridan is going to see everything they're doing. And I'm just going to make that comment because I'm going to try to summarize what I think I heard tonight, and then say what we can all just agree what we think council just said. Chief, if I understand correctly, that you right now have 92 officers, 19 are training, and those 19 in training are not available to do this type of work.
So that was as of the week prior to last. 8 of them have come out. We still have 10 in training and 5 more positions to fill. And those will not obviously be available.
So you're down 15 officers from what you're authorized to do based on you and council's opinion is what you should do. And the bottom line is that you've assigned those officers to places where you think they need to be. And that if council changed your priority tonight and say, we want you to shut down this park for 4 or 5 weeks, you're saying on page 5, you'd have to take somebody from the traffic units, the school resource officer, Flatiron service units, investigating divisions, something that you haven't done, you would do if council told you to, because that's the whole relationship we have. I didn't hear, and I guess that's what I'm trying to summarize for the public, is that we're down 15 officers, and so you have limited resources. You obviously would shut down the park if you were instructed to. I didn't hear enough council members tonight. I heard 2 or 3 council members talking about temporary shutdown. I didn't hear enough direction tonight for you to do that. What I did hear direction from a lot of people was to maybe approach a lot of the churches and others, and maybe the Parks and Rec, and try to find ways to get these kids to do other things. I do think, I think, we're talking about coming back in session on June 8th. Jennifer assures everybody we're going to have July 4th, and and so we're talking about a fairly short time before we're back to some type of reasonable normality. If we don't go to normality, let's just say we don't have 4th of July, then we may have to revisit some of these issues. But right now, we're all acting like like we're going to get back to some normalcy. Let's just say in June, and I'm seeing, and so I empathize with the neighborhood. We taking the resources to do what to shut down that park, I don't think is where council feels you need to head. I'll understand there's council members that would like to do that, maybe experimental. And so I guess once again, I'll say the same thing to Jennifer. I mean, that's the input I heard from council.
Thank you. I think that's the consensus among us here as well.
Okay, and so we'll leave it at that, and we'll then call it a night. So that ends our study session. Thank you, everybody, for being here at 9:57. That ain't bad. And so thank you, everybody.
Thank y'all.
Good night.
Night. Night.